The woman hit the platform board so hard her knees left marks in the wood. She didn't fall. She was pushed. The man who did it, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, wearing a coat that cost more than most families in Iron Creek earned in a year, didn't even look back. He just straightened his cuff, stepped over her outstretched hand, and said to the station master loud enough for the whole platform to hear, "Get that off my train." Not her. That. Evelyn Hart was 26 years old, and she had heard herself called many things in the past 18 months. Charity case. Burden. Mistake. But she had never been called to that before, had never been reduced to a thing to be removed, not until the moment Aldous Crane decided the seat she was sitting in, the seat she had paid for with the last money she had in the world, was a seat he wanted for his luggage. She got up. Her right knee was bleeding through her stocking. She picked up her bag, one bag, battered, the clasp broken, and held shut with a length of twine. And she stood straight, because that was the one thing left she could still control. Nobody helped her. 40, maybe 50 people on that platform, and not one of them moved. If you had been standing there that afternoon, watching a woman pull herself up off the boards with blood running down her leg, and a crowd looking anywhere but at her, what would you have done? What could you do when the man who knocked her down owned half the county? This is the story of Evelyn Hart, a woman who arrived in Iron Creek, Montana with nothing but a broken bag and a name that meant nothing to anyone. A woman this town decided, before she ever opened her mouth, that they already knew everything about. They were wrong about all of it. If you're watching from your city or your country, drop it in the comments below. I want to know how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because the people who stay until the end of this one always come back. Hit the like button and stay with me. The train from Billings came in 11 minutes late, which was considered on time by Iron Creek standards. Caleb Voss had been standing on the platform for 40 minutes, which was not something he planned to admit to anyone. He'd told himself he arrived early because the mare needed exercise, and the road into town ran past the station anyway. He told himself that 3 or 4 times, standing there watching the eastern horizon for a plume of smoke, until he stopped bothering to tell himself anything and just stood with his hat in his hands and waited. He was 34. He looked older. The frontier had a way of doing that, not all at once, but steadily, the way water wears stone, until one morning you catch yourself in a window's reflection and the man looking back at you seems to belong to a harder generation than the one you were born into. His hands were calloused past feeling in some places. There was a scar along his left jaw from a fence wire that snapped 4 winters ago. He had stopped being handsome in the way young men are handsome and become something else instead. Weathered, present, the kind of face that had been tested and hadn't broken, though there had been moments it came close. He didn't know what he was expecting. He had written to the agency in March, a letter that took him 4 drafts to finish because he kept stopping in the middle and feeling like a fool. Rancher, 34, Glacier County, Montana. 160 acres, cattle operation, currently producing below capacity. He hadn't written the part about the debt, or the part about Noah, or the part where he lay awake 3 nights out of 7 trying to figure out whether there was still a version of the future where the ranch survived. He'd kept it plain, practical. The agency had sent him a photograph and a letter written in careful handwriting that said the woman's name was Evelyn Hart, that she was 26, that she had experience with household management, that she was in good health. The photograph showed a woman sitting very straight in a chair, looking directly at the camera with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not smiling, not frowning, just present, as though she'd decided the camera was something to be looked at honestly rather than performed for. He'd kept the photograph in his shirt pocket for 3 weeks without quite meaning to. Now the train was pulling in, and the platform was crowded with the sort of people who always found reasons to be at the station when something worth watching might happen. The dry goods owner's wife, 2 of the Hennessy boys from the feed operation, Marta Schultz from the boarding house, who had a gift for being wherever information was being generated. Caleb had tried and failed to be invisible among them. The first passengers off the train were businessmen, a family with 3 children who immediately scattered toward the luggage cart, an older couple moving slowly and carefully down the steps. Then a gap. Then a commotion near the rear car that Caleb couldn't quite see through the crowd. He heard it before he saw it. A sharp sound that wasn't quite a shout, more like a collective intake of breath from the people nearest the back of the platform. Then the crowd shifted, and he had a clear line of sight to the rear car's steps, and what he saw was a woman on her hands and knees on the platform boards. She was already getting up by the time he started moving. He pushed through two people, got his shoulder past Marta Schultz, and by the time he reached the edge of the cleared space around her, Evelyn Hart was standing. One hand pressed flat against the side of the train car for balance, her right stocking dark with blood from the knee down. Her bag, the only bag she appeared to have, sitting in the gap between her feet where she'd apparently managed to hold on to it even going down. Aldous Crane was already 20 feet away, talking to someone Caleb didn't recognize, as though nothing had happened at all. "Are you, Caleb started. "I'm fine." She said it before he finished the question, in a tone that made it clear she'd been saying that sentence to people for a long time and had learned to say it fast before they could decide what to do about her answer. She turned and looked at him, and it was the same face from the photograph. Direct, measuring, not giving anything away, except that it was real now, three-dimensional, and there was a cut on her lower lip she was pressing together to stop the bleeding, and her eyes were the color of winter creek water, gray-green and very clear. "Caleb Voss," she said. "Yes." "Evelyn Hart." She didn't extend her hand. Both of hers were occupied, one on the train car, one on her bag. "I apologize for the delay." He didn't know what to say to that. She was apologizing to him. She was standing there bleeding on a platform in front of half the town, her clothes travel-worn in a way that told him the journey had been longer and harder than the agency letter suggested, and her first sentence to him was an apology for the train being late. "Don't," he said. She looked at him. "Don't apologize for that." He picked up her bag before she could argue about it. It was lighter than he expected, the kind of light that meant it didn't contain much. "Can you walk?" "Yes." She walked with a slight hitch, favoring the right leg, but she walked steadily, and she didn't reach for his arm. He led her off the platform, and she followed, and behind them he could feel the attention of 20 people like heat between his shoulder blades. He heard Marta Schultz say, quietly, but not quietly enough, "Well, that's what he's sent for." The wagon ride back to the ranch took an hour and 40 minutes on a good road day. Caleb had cleaned and wrapped her knee with the cloth he kept in the wagon box for exactly the kind of small emergencies that frontier life produced constantly, and she'd let him do it without comment, holding her skirt up just enough and looking out at the prairie while he worked. He'd done a clumsy job of it. He wasn't a man who spent much time on careful things. Neither of them spoke for the first 20 minutes. He'd thought about this conversation. He'd thought about it more than he wanted to admit. What he'd say, how he'd explain the situation, how to make it clear without sounding desperate, which he was, or apologetic, which he also was, or dishonest about what she was walking into. He'd drafted it in his head a dozen times. Every version started with something sensible and ended with him not being able to figure out how to say the ranch is failing, and I have an 8-year-old who hasn't spoken more than 2 sentences to a stranger since his father died, and I have no idea if any of this is going to work. "The agency letter described you as a widower," she said finally. "My brother died. Not me." He glanced at her. "I wrote that wrong. He left behind a son. Noah. He's 8. He lives with me now." She was quiet for a moment, processing that. "How long ago?" 2 years in October." "And the boy's mother?" "She left when Noah was 3, before any of this." He kept his eyes on the road. "I don't know where she is." Another pause. He could feel her recalibrating something, the picture in her head of what she was arriving at. "The letter also said the ranch was producing," she said. Not an accusation, just a statement, flat and observational. "It was. 2 years ago it was." He adjusted the reins. The mare, Bess, knew this road well enough to manage it half asleep, but he liked having something to do with his hands. "It will be again. That's why I wrote to the agency. I need help. I'm not looking for someone to be a servant. I need someone who can manage the house and help with Noah while I work the cattle end of things. It's a working arrangement. That's what I can offer." "What can't you offer?" The directness of it caught him off guard. He looked at her again, and she was watching him steadily, waiting. I can't offer you anything resembling comfort for a while. The house needs work. I can't offer you certainty because I don't have any. I can't offer you—" He stopped. "I can offer you a roof, food, a fair arrangement in writing if you want it, and I'll tell you the truth when you ask me something, which I'm doing now." She looked back at the road ahead of them. The prairie stretched in every direction, the grass going golden in the late afternoon light, the mountains far to the west still holding snow on their upper faces. "That's more than some people offer," she said. He didn't ask what she meant by that. He thought he probably didn't need to. The ranch announced itself from a quarter-mile away. Caleb watched her take it in the way you watch someone open a gift you're not sure about, carefully, trying to read her reaction without being obvious about it. The fence line along the road was in decent shape. He'd repaired that section in spring because it was the first thing visitors saw. Beyond it, the picture got more complicated. The barn needed new siding on the north wall. The chicken coop listed slightly to the left. The house itself was structurally sound. He was confident about the bones of it. But the roof had shed 2 sections of shingle in last winter's storms, and the front porch had a soft board third from the steps that he'd been meaning to replace for 8 months. She didn't say anything. She took it in. All of it. The barn, the coop, the house, the half-repaired fence along the east pasture, and her face stayed even. Noah was standing on the porch. He'd been there when Caleb left that morning, and apparently he'd been there or thereabouts all day, because he was wearing the same clothes and his hair was in the same arrangement that happened when no adult had paid attention to it. He was small for 8, dark-haired like his father had been, and he had the particular stillness of a child who had learned that stillness was the safest thing to be. He watched them come up the road. He watched Caleb stop the wagon. He watched Evelyn climb down, refusing help again, which Caleb was already starting to recognize as a pattern. And he watched her pick up her bag and look at the house and then at him. "You're Noah," she said. He didn't answer. He'd done this with the last 2 women Caleb had brought out. The pastor's wife, who'd come to help for a week. The neighbor's daughter, who'd lasted 10 days, stared at them with that flat, assessing look until they got uncomfortable and looked away first. Most adults looked away. Evelyn didn't look away. She looked back at him with the same level steadiness he was giving her, and then she said, "The board on your porch is soft, third from the top. I almost went through it. Is there a place I can put my bag?" Noah stared at her for another 2 seconds. Then he opened the door and went inside. Caleb released a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "He's not," he started. "He's 8 years old and he's trying to figure out if I'm going to disappear," she said. "That takes time." She went up the porch steps, testing each one, and opened the door he'd been too slow to open for her. "Is there hot water?" "Bots." She didn't ask for a tour. She walked through the house herself, room by room, while Caleb put the wagon up and tended to Bess, and by the time he came back inside, she'd found the kitchen, found the pump, found where the wood was stored, and started a fire in the stove. Noah was sitting at the kitchen table watching her. He'd pulled his chair to the corner, which was also a thing he did, positioning himself where he could see everything without being easily seen. Evelyn moved around the kitchen as though he wasn't watching her, and as though the state of the kitchen, which Caleb knew, without illusions, was not good, was not a particular surprise to her. There was a pot on the stove within 20 minutes. Caleb didn't know what was in it. He hadn't asked. He'd been doing inventory of the barn, which needed to be done anyway, telling himself he wasn't avoiding the house, which he partly was. He came in at dusk. The kitchen smelled like something he hadn't smelled in that room in 2 years. Food cooking that someone had actually put thought into, not just flour and water, and whatever was easy. He stood in the doorway for a moment without going in. Noah was still at the table. He had, at some point, acquired a piece of charcoal and a scrap of paper and was drawing something Caleb couldn't see from the doorway. Evelyn was at the stove, her back to both of them, and she was talking. Just talking, steady and low, not asking Noah to respond, not requiring anything from him. "The woman at the boarding house in Billings told me I'd need heavier boots than what I had. I told her I'd manage. She told me I was going to freeze. She was probably right about the boots." A pause, a sound of stirring. I'm usually better at admitting when I'm wrong than I am at admitting it beforehand. That's a flaw. I'm working on it. Noah made no sound, but his charcoal had stopped moving. He was listening. Your uncle's fence on the south side, she went on. The second post from the gate is leaning. I don't know if you noticed. It's not broken yet, but it's going to go by spring if someone doesn't reset it. You can usually tell the ones that are going to go, they have a kind of lean to them that looks like they're tired. Like they've been holding against the pressure so long they've just run out of reasons to keep doing it. She paused again. Caleb didn't move. Noah said very quietly, like people. Evelyn didn't make a big thing of it. She didn't turn around and exclaim or press him. She just said, yes, exactly like people, and went back to stirring. Caleb stepped back from the doorway so neither of them could see him, and he stood in the dark of the hallway with his back against the wall and the smell of supper coming through the door, and he stayed there for a while. Supper was quiet in the way that supper at that table had been quiet since Thomas died. Caleb ate. Noah ate, which was itself not always guaranteed. There'd been a stretch last spring where getting food into the boy had been a daily project requiring patience Caleb ran out of more often than he wanted to admit. Evelyn ate without appearing to notice that the table was uneven, or that two of the chairs were repaired with wire, or that the lamp was burning low because he'd forgotten to fill it. How much of the herd are you running? She asked. He told her. He told her the number now, the number it should be, the number it had been before Thomas died, and the ranch had a winter where neither of them had the focus to do things right. He told her about the debt to the Billings Bank, which was the thing he'd been dreading telling her most, and he told it plain and fast the way you rip out a splinter, better quick than slow. She listened. She asked 2 questions, the interest rate and whether the terms were fixed. He told her both. She nodded once and looked at her plate and said, "That's manageable." "Is it?" "If the operation grows the way it should. It's tight, but it's manageable." She looked up at him. "I kept accounts at my father's store for 6 years before he sold it. I'm not a banker, but I understand numbers." That was more than he knew about her. He realized he didn't know much at all. The agency letter had been sparse, and the photograph had told him only what a photograph tells you, which is the surface of things. "What happened to your father's store?" he said. Something crossed her face. Not distress. More like a door closing, quick and professional. "He died. The debts outlasted the assets." She reached to move the lamp slightly toward Noah, who was scraping the bottom of his bowl with the focus of a child who has been reliably hungry at some point in recent memory. "It happens." He didn't push. The door was closed, and he recognized a closed door. Later, after Noah was in bed, he'd gone without argument, which Caleb noted as unusual. Evelyn stood at the kitchen pump and washed the dishes. Caleb had offered. She'd declined the offer in that same quick way, not rude, just efficient, so he sat at the table and drank the last of the coffee and let her. "I'll need to know what the house needs," she said. "Not all of it tonight, but I want to start making a list." "The list is long." "Lists usually are. That's not a reason not to make them." She set a bowl upside down on the counter to dry. "The roof. Is it leaking into the house?" "Not into the main rooms. There's a section in the storage room at the back. That needs to be done before the snow comes." "I know." "What about the floorboards in the south bedroom?" He looked at her. "You already found those?" "I walked through the house." She glanced back at him over her shoulder. "There are 2 that are rotten through. If you step wrong, you'll go through." "I know," he said again. He said it with slightly less certainty. "Those need to be done soon, too." She turned back to the dishes. "What did the previous women do?" "The agency said you'd had 2 prior placements." He thought about how to answer that. "They left," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a wind had come up off the mountain, pushing at the windows. Because it was harder than they thought. And because... He stopped. Noah wasn't easy. "He's easy enough," she said. "He's just watching to see if you're worth trusting. That's not hard. That's just sensible." He lay awake that night in his room, listening to the house settle. He could hear, faintly, a sound from the room at the end of the hall, Noah's room, that it took him a moment to place because he hadn't heard it in long enough that he'd stopped listening for it. Noah was talking, not loud enough to make out words, just the murmur of a child talking the way children talk sometimes before sleep, to no one in particular, to themselves, to whatever thoughts need to be said out loud before they can be let go. Caleb had not heard that sound in 8 months. He turned onto his back and looked at the dark ceiling and thought about Aldous Crane on that platform, stepping over a woman's outstretched hand like she was something to be avoided. He'd recognized Crane. Everyone in 4 counties recognized Crane, and he thought about the way Crane had said, "Get that off my train," and the way not one person on that platform had moved. He hadn't moved either. He'd been too far back, and by the time he got through the crowd, she was already up. He'd think about that for a while, not punishingly. He wasn't a man who punished himself at length. It didn't accomplish anything. But he'd think about it. He thought about her saying, "That's more than some people offer," in a tone that wasn't bitter, just factual, the way you state a measurement you've taken several times and are now certain of. He thought about Noah saying, like people, and the way she hadn't made it into a moment, just let it be what it was and moved on, which was exactly right, which was the thing Caleb himself had never quite managed to do. He always either made too much of it or not enough, never hit the right register. She'd hit it first try. He slept eventually, not well, but better than most nights.
Good.
She was up before him. He came down at first light, and she was at the stove, and the fire was already built, and there was something in the pan that smelled like it had onion in it, and she was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the east pasture with a coffee cup in one hand and an expression on her face he couldn't read. "There's a man in your field," she said, when she heard him on the stairs. "East fence line. He's been there about 10 minutes. Caleb crossed to the window. It took him a moment to find the figure. A man on horseback, just outside the fence, sitting still. Too far to make out clearly. But the horse was a gray, and there weren't many gray horses in Glacier County that Caleb didn't know. He knew that one. "That's Dale Runyon," he said. "He works for Crane." "What does he want in your field at dawn?" "He's not in the field. He's at the fence line." The distinction mattered, technically. He's looking. At what? At what they had. At how many cattle were in the east pasture, at whether the house was occupied, at what shape the operation was in. Crane had been interested in the Voss land for 3 years. The interest had increased after Thomas died. "At whatever Crane sent him to look at," Caleb said. She turned from the window and looked at him directly. "Is this a pattern? Crane. Does he do this regularly?" He hadn't planned to get into this today. He'd planned to let her settle for at least a week before any of this. "He has an interest in acquiring land in this area." "Your land specifically?" "My land is between 2 pieces he already owns." She looked back out the window. Runyon hadn't moved. "What happens if he gets it?" "He doesn't get it." "What happens if he does?" She said it without inflection, not pushing, just asking, the same way she'd asked about the fence post that was leaning, practical, and clear-eyed. Caleb poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made. It was stronger than his, which he noted. "Noah and I have nowhere to go," he said. She set down her cup on the counter, reached up and pushed her hair back from her face, which was just waking up in the same way everything was just waking up, unhurried and without any attempt to look otherwise. "Then we'd better make sure that doesn't happen," she said. Outside, Dale Runyon turned his gray horse slowly and rode back the way he'd come. Evelyn watched him go until he was gone from sight, and then she turned back to the stove and moved the pan and started talking about the supply list, what they needed from town, how much she thought they were paying too much for at the current supplier, and whether there was a way to get the flour and salt cheaper in bulk. And Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and his thoughts and listened to her, and found, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, that he wasn't entirely alone inside a problem. It was a strange feeling. He didn't trust it yet, but he didn't push it away either. By mid-morning, she had found the rot under the storage room's east wall, the broken spoke on the well mechanism that was making the draw harder than it should be, 3 jars of preserved summer stock that had sealed badly and would need to be discarded, and a gap in the barn wall that Caleb had patched with burlap last January and forgotten about. He found her in the barn, on her knees in the dirt, Looking at the base of the patched wall, her good dress, the one she'd arrived in, the only one she appeared to own, already dusty at the knees, her hair loose on one side where a pin had come out. "This burlap is going to fail before December," she said without looking up. "I know. Do you have planking?" "Some. Not enough for the whole wall." "Enough for this section?" he thought. "Maybe." "That's a yes or no." "Yes," he said. She got up, brushing her hands on her dress in a matter-of-fact way that suggested she'd long ago given up being precious about fabric. "Then we should do it this week, before the first hard freeze." "We." She looked at him. "You said we," he said. "I'm aware of what I said." She picked up her pin from the ground and twisted her hair back. "Is that a problem?" He looked at her for a moment. This woman who had arrived yesterday with blood on her leg and one bag with a broken clasp, who had been here less than 24 hours and had already found every weakness in the place that he'd been too exhausted or too overwhelmed to see clearly, who had made his nephew speak for the first time in months, who had woken before him and made coffee and noticed a man in the east pasture and asked the right questions about it. "No," he said. "It's not a problem." She turned toward the house. He fell into step beside her. "The porch board," she said. "This week." "Before the barn wall." "They can be the same week." "They should be," she agreed. "And the storage room roof?" "Give me the list," he said. "I'll figure out the order." She stopped walking and turned to look at him, and something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, more like the almost version of one, the shape a smile makes before it fully arrives. "I already have a list," she said. He believed it. Behind them, the east pasture lay quiet and gold in the morning light, and somewhere above the barn a hawk turned slow circles in the cold air, and inside the house, at the kitchen window, a small dark-haired boy watched the two of them walk across the yard together and said nothing, and kept watching, and didn't look away. The list she'd written covered both sides of a scrap of paper she'd found in the kitchen drawer, and when Caleb unfolded it the next morning over his coffee, the first thing he noticed was how organized it was. Not just a list of things that needed fixing, but a sequence, items ranked by urgency and dependency, the ones that had to happen before the other ones could happen, marked with a small star in the margin. The second thing he noticed was how many stars there were. "You found the buckle on the cellar hatch," he said. "It's not latching properly. If you get a hard wind from the north, it'll blow open." She was at the stove without looking at him. "When it's open, water gets in." "I know." "Then it should have a star." He looked at the paper. "You already gave it a star." "I know," she said. He drank his coffee and read through the rest of it. She'd added things he hadn't said aloud. The well spoke, which he'd mentioned, but also the issue with the kitchen pump seal, which he hadn't, and a note about the south bedroom floorboards that specified exactly which boards and in what order they should be replaced. She had also, at the bottom of the second side, written a column of numbers that turned out to be a rough accounting of the household's weekly supply costs against what she estimated they were actually spending, and the gap between the two columns was not comfortable to look at. "You went through the supply records," he said. "You keep them in the drawer by the door. I assumed they weren't private." "They're not." He set the paper down. "The gap there is because you've been buying flour at the Hennessy rate, which is the convenience rate, not the bulk rate, and because whoever was buying salt last winter bought it in small quantities." She paused. "Small quantities of anything on a frontier ranch cost you in the long run. You know that." "I do know that." "Last winter was difficult," she said, not as an accusation, just as a statement of the obvious that covered a lot of ground. She set a plate in front of him. Eggs, some kind of fried potato, a piece of bread that was a day old but had been crisped on the stove's surface, so it was worth eating. It was better than what he'd been making himself, which had lately been the kind of food that kept a person upright without giving them a reason to look forward to it. He ate. She moved around the kitchen doing 3 things at once in a way that didn't look hurried, tidying while the stove cooled, checking what was in the cold box, making a notation on a second piece of paper she'd located somewhere. Noah appeared in the doorway at 7:30, hair unsettled, shirt not quite tucked, and stopped when he saw Evelyn like he'd walked into a room he expected to be empty and found it occupied. "There's oatmeal," she said, not turning around. "Unless you'd rather have what he's having, in which case you need to tell me now before I put the pan away." A pause. "What he's having," Noah said. She didn't make a thing of it, she just reached for the pan. Caleb watched his nephew climb into his chair and fold his hands on the table in the patient, watchful way he had, and thought about the fact that this was the second morning in a row that Noah had come down to breakfast voluntarily, without Caleb having to knock twice on his door and stand in the hallway waiting. It was possible that meant nothing. It was possible it meant something. He was trying not to attach too much to it, because he'd attached things before, and then they'd gone sideways and it had cost Noah more. He looked at the list. He looked at the numbers in the bottom column. He looked at the plate in front of him. He picked up his fork and ate. The porch board was the first thing, because she was right that it was a hazard, and also because it was the kind of task he could do in an afternoon without anyone's help and feel like something had actually moved. He pulled the soft board, cut a new piece from the plank he had in the barn, set it in, and secured it with the last of his good nails, which meant a trip to town for nails was now also on the list. She was on the roof of the storage room when he finished. He stood below looking up at her for a long moment before he said anything, because it took him that long to process the fact that she was up there at all. On the roof in her work dress, with her skirt knotted up at the knee so it wasn't catching, sliding a piece of cut shingle into place with the flat of her hand. "What are you doing?" he said. "What does it look like?" "Get down from there." She looked down at him from the edge of the roof line. "The gap is 2 feet wide. If I don't close it before tonight, it's going to let cold air into the storage room and you're going to lose whatever you have down there." "I'll close it." "You're doing the porch." "I finished the porch." She looked at the shingle in her hand. "Then come up and hold the other end of this. I can't quite reach." He stood there for another 3 seconds, feeling the particular irritation of a man who has decided to be sensible about something and found that the other person has skipped directly past sensible to done. He went to the barn for the ladder. He climbed up. She handed him the far end of the shingle and he held it flat against the roofing while she drove the nail. And then she drove a second nail and said, "Let go." And he let go and the piece held. "You've done this before," he said. "My father's store had a roof." "That's not the same as—" "My father never went up on roofs," she said, already moving to the next gap, which was smaller. "So someone had to." He sat back on the low pitch of the storage room roof and watched her work, which she did with the concentration of someone who had spent years doing things that needed to be done right and didn't have anyone to check their work afterward. She drove nails cleanly, which was harder than most people thought. Her hands were not soft. They hadn't been soft even when she arrived, which told him something about the story the agency letter had not included. "The agency said you managed a household," he said. "I did." "Whose?" She paused between nails. "My own. After my father died." She fit the second shingle into position. "I had a house and a debt. I managed both for 2 years until the debt won." "And then?" "And then I had neither." She drove the nail. "So I wrote to the agency." He stayed quiet. The wind was coming in from the west and the mountains across the valley were going the color they went in afternoon light, blue-gray and enormous, the kind of view you could live inside for years and still catch yourself stopping to look at. "You didn't tell the agency any of that," he said. "They didn't ask." She moved to inspect the third section of roofing, testing it with her palm. "They asked if I was in good health and if I could manage a household. Both were true." "The debt was not their business and not yours," she said, and it was the first time she'd said anything to him with any edge in it, not anger, just a boundary, stated plainly. She looked at him over her shoulder. "I'm not asking about your debt." "I told you about my debt." "I know, that was your choice." She turned back to the roof. "I'm choosing differently. That's allowed." He thought about arguing. He decided not to. She was right, technically, and also she was on his roof fixing his shingles and he was sitting here questioning her, which was not his best performance. "Fair enough," he said. She said nothing, which he was starting to understand was her version of accepting an apology. The trouble in town started at the dry goods store. Caleb had sent Evelyn in for the supply run on Thursday because he had cattle to move in the east pasture and the timing overlapped, and he'd given her the money and the list and thought nothing of it, except that he should have given her a larger amount because her list was longer than his. He heard about it from Pete Garza, who ran the livery next to the dry goods, and who had the kind of neighborly disposition that meant he told Caleb things without quite framing it as gossip, because he wasn't that kind of man. He was just a man who believed other men should know what was being said around them. What was being said was this, that Evelyn Hart had come into Baxter's dry goods and presented a list that was the longest single order the Baxter family had seen from the Voss Ranch in 3 years, and that she had negotiated the flour price down by asking directly about the bulk rate and pointing out that 3 other ranches in the county were being offered a lower figure, and that Louise Baxter, who was her husband's business partner in practice, even if the sign over the door only had one name on it, had told Evelyn that it was not customary for a woman in her position to be conducting supply negotiations on behalf of a man's ranch. Evelyn had apparently said, "What position is that?" And Louise Baxter had said, "A woman who arrived here with nothing, from nowhere, for reasons nobody knows." And Evelyn had said, "I arrived with a legal arrangement and an ability to read a price sheet. Is the bulk rate available or not?" She got the bulk rate. She also, Pete said, spent 12 minutes at the counter going through the itemized total and finding 2 arithmetic errors, both in Baxter's favor, and had them corrected. She came home with everything on the list, correct change, and a receipt that had been corrected in 2 places and initialed. Caleb looked at the receipt. He looked at the corrected figures. He put the receipt in the kitchen drawer where he kept such things, and didn't say anything to her about Louise Baxter or Pete Garza or any of it, and she didn't say anything either, and they had supper and the evening was quiet. But he noticed, after she'd gone to bed, that she had come back from town with her jaw set differently than it had been when she left, and that she hadn't quite looked at him directly when she handed over the receipt, and that the particular evenness she usually carried had a faint crack in it, the way good wood sometimes shows a hairline fault that isn't weakness but is where the pressure went. He thought about that for a while. Noah found her system on Saturday morning. He'd been circling the house the way he circled things he was interested in, wide loops that kept getting smaller, pretending to be doing something else while actually just getting closer. Caleb had watched him do this with the new calf in March, spending 3 days in the vicinity of the calf's pen doing other things, until the morning Caleb came out to find Noah sitting inside the pen with the calf's head in his lap. The system in question was the series of small marks Evelyn had started making on the door frames. She had a piece of chalk. Caleb didn't know where she'd found it, possibly in Noah's room, possibly somewhere else, and she'd been using it to mark the door frames and window frames of the rooms she'd assessed, small symbols that apparently meant something to her, a shorthand record of what needed to happen and in what order. The storage room door had 3 marks. The kitchen window frame had 2. The back hall had one that she'd circled. Noah stood in front of the kitchen window frame looking at the 2 marks, and when Evelyn came through the kitchen with an armload of the badly sealed jars she was clearing out of the cellar, he said, "What do these mean?" She set the jars on the table and looked at the marks. "That one means the seal needs replacing. That one means it's got a cold gap. Air's getting through somewhere in the frame." She pointed to each in turn. "Why not just write it? Chalk runs out fast if you write whole words. Marks are faster." She picked up the jars again. "If you want, I can teach you the marks." Noah looked at the window frame. He looked at her. "There are more in the storage room," he said. 3. That room has more problems." "What about the barn?" "I haven't done the barn yet. That's next." He followed her to the cellar steps, not quite helping, not quite not helping. When she started down the steps, he said, "I can carry those." And she handed him 2 of the jars without discussion, just a straightforward transfer, and he carried them to the box she was using for discards without being asked to do it any particular way. They did 6 trips between them, and by the end of it, Noah was explaining to her the difference between the jars that his uncle had put up last year and the ones that had been in the cellar since before his father died, because he knew which was which. He'd been down here enough times that he could tell by where they were sitting on the shelves, and Evelyn listened with the full attention of someone who considered this information genuinely useful. It was useful. She asked him which of the remaining jars he was most confident about, and marked those separately for the winter supply. Caleb found them in the cellar at noon when he came in for water, The two of them standing at the shelf in the cold of the underground room, with Evelyn's chalk marks on the jars and Noah talking with his hands in a way Caleb hadn't seen him do since before Thomas died. He went back outside without disturbing them. The first hard knock came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after she arrived. Caleb had been expecting something. Crane didn't send a man to sit at your fence line at dawn and then do nothing. He was the kind of man who moved in stages. First the watching, then the pressure, then the offer that was really a threat arranged to look like generosity. Caleb had seen it happen to 2 other operations in the county in the past 4 years, both of which Crane now owned. The knock was from a man named Garrett, who worked for the Glacier County Land Office and who came with papers that were technically a notice of assessment, a formal review of the Voss land's current valuation, tied to a tax structure adjustment that was being applied across the county. Nothing personal, just routine, except that the adjusted rate was not routine and the timing was not coincidence, and the new assessment came in at a figure that would require Caleb to either pay a tax bill by March that he couldn't currently cover or open discussions about the property's future. Open discussions. That was the phrase Garrett used. Evelyn was in the kitchen. Caleb handled it at the door, took the papers, said he'd read them, and closed the door with enough control that it didn't quite slam. He stood in the hallway and looked at the papers. He could feel his pulse in his temples, which happened when he was angry and trying not to be, because anger without a target in front of you was just heat with nowhere to go, and it didn't help anything. He breathed out through his nose and unfolded the papers and read the assessment figure and breathed out again. "What is it?" She was in the kitchen doorway. He handed her the papers. He wasn't sure why. He hadn't planned to, hadn't decided to. His hand just extended the papers toward her because she was the person standing there, and she'd asked. She read them. She read them carefully, the way she did most things, not fast, not performing speed, just thoroughly. Her expression didn't change much, except that her jaw got slightly tighter when she reached the assessment figure. "Is this Crane?" she said. "It's the land office, but yes." She looked at the papers another moment. "What's the deadline?" "March 15th. And the figure they're using for the assessment," she turned to the second page. "This is based on a land survey from 1879. That's the one on file. Has anyone done a new survey?" He looked at her. "Why would that matter?" "Because the 1879 survey may not account for the improvements made since then, or changes in the land's productive capacity." She tapped the paper. "A new survey could change the assessment basis. It won't make the rate go away, but it might change what they're applying it to." He hadn't thought about that. He hadn't thought of it because he'd been standing in the hallway being angry, which was the opposite of thinking. "I don't know a surveyor," he said. "I know someone in Billings who might." She said it simply, like it was information she'd been keeping without knowing she'd need it, the way you pack a thing in a bag out of habit and then find it's exactly what you needed. "He did work for my father's store when there was a boundary dispute with the neighbor. He's accurate and he's not expensive." Caleb looked at her. "I'll write a letter tonight," she said, "if you want." "Write the letter," he said. The letter went out Wednesday. No answer could come back for at least 2 weeks, and in the meantime the daily work of the ranch continued at the pace the ranch demanded, which was the pace of something that didn't care what else you had to deal with. It was in those 2 weeks that Caleb started seeing what Evelyn actually was. Not what he'd thought she was, which was capable. He'd understood she was capable from nearly the first morning, not what the town thought she was, which was a desperate woman making the best of a bad situation. Something more specific, something that was harder to name. She didn't quit things. It sounded obvious, stated plainly, but he had lived long enough and worked beside enough people to know that not quitting is rarer than it looks. Most people quit before they say they do. They go through the motions, they show up, but something in them has closed the door and is just waiting for the situation to resolve itself one way or another. He'd done it himself, briefly, in the bad months after Thomas. He'd kept working because the cattle needed feeding and Noah needed someone present, but he'd done it with the door closed, just maintaining, not building anything. Evelyn had the door open. She'd repaired the storage room roof and the porch board and the cellar latch and the south bedroom floorboards, the bedroom that turned out to be hers, which meant she'd fixed her own floor, matter-of-factly, the morning she found it, without mentioning that she'd slept one night with compromised boards under her. She'd reorganized the supply storage so that what they used most was at the front and what they used least was at the back, which sounds simple and is, except that no one had done it, and it saved 20 minutes a week and 20 minutes a week added up. She'd started teaching Noah reading in the evenings, not formally, not with any kind of lesson structure he could see. Just reading to him from whatever book she'd found in the house, stopping to ask him what words meant, waiting for him to guess before she told him. Noah was guessing. He was wrong more often than right, but he was guessing, which was the thing that mattered because guessing meant engaging, and engaging meant something in him was coming back from wherever it had gone. Caleb noticed all of it. He noticed it the way you notice weather, not always consciously, not in the way you describe to someone else, but as a change in the condition of things, a shift in what the air felt like. What he didn't notice quickly enough was the second problem. Her name was Ada Hennessy, and she was the wife of Douglas Hennessy, who ran the feed operation and was also on the town council and was also the kind of man who believed that what happened in a community was his business by virtue of having been born into it first. Ada Hennessy had opinions about Evelyn Hart that she shared with anyone who stood still long enough. The opinions were that Evelyn had come from nowhere, that no woman in that circumstance was without a history worth examining, that her managing of Caleb's supply account was overstepping, that her presence in a house with a man she wasn't properly married to was a subject of moral interest, and that Noah was a child who needed proper raising, not whatever arrangement was happening out at the Voss ranch. Caleb heard the version of this that Pete Garza could bring himself to repeat, which was probably the softened version. He heard it on a Thursday morning when he came into town for the nails that had been on the list since the porch board job, and Pete had that particular look of a man about to say something he wishes he didn't have to. "It's Ada," Caleb said before Pete finished. "She talked to the pastor," Pete said, "about the propriety of the situation." Caleb stood in the livery doorway. The sun was cold and clear, and the street was ordinary. People going about their Thursday, nothing dramatic, just the slow, ordinary pressure of a small town deciding what it thought about a thing. "There's nothing improper happening," he said. "I know that. The agency arranged the placement. It's documented." "I know that too." Pete worked a piece of harness leather between his hands in the way he did when he was uncomfortable. "Ada's not talking about documents." Caleb walked the rest of the way to the hardware in silence, bought the nails, and drove back to the ranch. He told Evelyn that evening. He told her after Noah was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up because the days were getting shorter and the dark came earlier now. And he told it plain because he'd decided she deserved to hear it plain, not softened. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, her hands flat on the table. "Does it change anything?" she said. "Not for me." "For the ranch? For your standing with the town?" He thought about it honestly. "It might complicate things. Ada Hennessy has a reach." "Then we should deal with it." "How?" She looked at the table. "Visibility," she said. "People say things in the dark. In the open, with witnesses, it's harder." She looked up at him. "I should be seen in town, doing ordinary things, not hiding." "You weren't hiding." "I know, but I should be seen not hiding." She pushed back her chair and went to the counter, did something with the dishes that didn't need doing, came back. "And I should be useful to more people than just you. If Ada Hennessy tells the town I'm a problem and half the town has reason to think I'm not, that's a different conversation." He watched her sit back down. "You've done this before." She met his eyes. "Managed a reputation in a small place that decided what it thought about me before it knew me?" A pause. "Yes." He didn't ask where. He didn't ask when. The door was the door. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. Tot. The first thing she did was go to Marta Schultz. Marta ran the boarding house and was the town's actual information center, more reliably than the newspaper. And she had a daughter, Clara, who was 11 and had trouble with figures the way some children had trouble with letters. Not because she was slow, but because the way she was being taught didn't match the way her mind worked. Evelyn had heard about this from Pete Garza's wife in a passing comment that Evelyn apparently filed and retrieved 3 weeks later, because that was how her mind worked. She went on a Saturday morning, and she brought a book, and she offered to work with Clara on figures for an hour a week for nothing. And Marta Schultz, who was not a sentimental woman, had looked at her for a long time and then said, "You'd do that." "I'd do that," Evelyn said. The second thing was the widow Crane. Not Aldous Crane. His mother, Helena Crane, who was 71 and had nothing to do with her son's business practices, and who had hurt her wrist in a fall in October and could not manage her own preserving jars. Helena Crane lived alone in a house at the north end of town and was not particularly liked because she was sharp-tongued and didn't pretend otherwise, but she was old and she was in pain and she needed help. Evelyn went on a Wednesday. She went with 2 jars of the preserves she'd put up at the ranch, the good ones, not the ones with the bad seal. And she spent 4 hours with Helena Crane helping her get her winter stores in order and listening to the old woman talk about the years before Iron Creek had a real road, when the frontier was actually a frontier and nobody was pretending about what it cost. Caleb heard about this last one from 3 separate people before the week was out. Helena Crane, who had not asked anyone for help in living memory, had told her housekeeper that the Voss woman had good hands and a good mind, and anyone who said otherwise was a fool. This was, by Iron Creek standards, an endorsement approximately equivalent to a written proclamation. Evelyn came home that Wednesday evening smelling like wood smoke from Helena Crane's stove, and she was tired, actually tired, not managing it, the kind of tired that showed in how she moved, and she sat down at the kitchen table and accepted the cup of coffee Caleb put in front of her without commenting on the fact that he'd made it or that it was weaker than hers. Noah came and sat across from her with his piece of charcoal and his paper and drew something without explaining what it was. And the 3 of them were quiet for a while in the way that had become, without anyone arranging it, the end of their days. "Good day?" Caleb said. "Long day," she said. "Helena Crane is difficult." "Everyone knows that?" "She's also funny," Evelyn said, with a slight surprise in her voice, like she'd discovered something she hadn't expected to find. "She told me about the time 3 men tried to cheat her husband out of a land claim in 1861, and she went to the territorial office herself and had the paperwork corrected. The clerk tried to tell her women couldn't conduct such business." A pause. "She said she told him the paperwork couldn't read." Caleb looked at her across the lamp's light. She was looking at her coffee, something working in her face that she probably didn't know was visible. "What?" she said, without looking up. "Nothing," he said. But it wasn't nothing. It was the beginning of something he hadn't named yet, that lived in the space between what he'd sent for, a practical arrangement, a working partnership, a solution to a problem, and what had actually arrived, which was a woman who went to a difficult old widow and listened to her for 4 hours and came home finding her funny, who fixed her own floor without mentioning it, who read to a grieving boy until he started guessing at words, who took a land assessment notice and immediately thought to ask about the survey date. He didn't name it. He was a careful man, and careful men didn't name things until they were sure. But he looked at her in the lamp's light, and at Noah bent over his drawing, and at the kitchen that was slowly becoming a room where things happened instead of just a room where they waited. And he thought, this is different from what I expected. He thought, I need to stop being surprised by that. Outside, the wind picked up off the mountains, cold and steady, the sound of a Montana autumn doing what Montana autumns did, which was remind you that winter was not a rumor and that the things you hadn't yet done would announce themselves soon. Inside, the lamp held. The coffee cooled. Noah showed Evelyn his drawing, a horse, recognizably, with a fence behind it that had one leaning post, and she looked at it with the seriousness it deserved and said, "The post on the left, that's the one." He nodded, satisfied, and turned the paper back over. The 3 of them stayed at the table until the lamp started to gutter, and no one was in a hurry to say goodnight. The surveyor's letter came back in 11 days, which was faster than Caleb expected, and suggested the man in Billings either had a slow week or Evelyn's letter had been more persuasive than a standard inquiry. His name was Orson Flegg, and he wrote in a precise, unhurried hand that he could be in Iron Creek by the 2nd week of November, that his rate was $12 for a full boundary survey with written documentation, and that he had conducted 3 previous surveys in Glacier County and was familiar with the land office's filing requirements. He also noted, in a postscript that Caleb read twice, that he was aware of at least 2 other assessment disputes in the county in the past year where updated survey documentation had successfully challenged the basis of revised tax figures. Caleb put the letter on the kitchen table and looked at it. "He's done this before," he said. Evelyn was standing at the window, reading her own copy of the letter. She'd written to Flagg directly, so the reply had come to her name, which had produced a small moment at the post office that Pete Garza had relayed with his usual mix of observation and discomfort. "That's why I wrote to him and not someone else," she said. $12 is manageable. You keep using that word. She looked up from the letter. Because things keep being manageable. That's not optimism. It's arithmetic. She set the letter down. If Flagg's documentation changes the assessment basis by even 15%, you recover the $12 in the first tax payment. He knew she was right. He knew it the way he knew most things she told him. Not because she explained it to him like he was slow, but because she stated it plainly and the plainness made the truth of it obvious. It was a quality he'd noticed in very few people. Most people, when they knew something you didn't, either over-explained it or withheld it. She just said it. He wrote back to Flagg that afternoon, November 2nd, if that worked. October moved. The way October moved on the Montana frontier saw fast at the start, brutal at the end, with a brief, brilliant stretch in the middle where the light went gold and the air smelled like cold grass and wood smoke, and something almost like grace before the season shut down entirely. Caleb had lived through 15 of these Octobers on this land, and he still caught himself stopping to look at the mountains in that particular light, the way a man stops and looks at something he knows is temporary. The ranch was in better shape than it had been in September. Not good shape. Good was still a long way off, but measurably better, with the storage room sealed and the porch sound and the south bedroom floorboards replaced and the cellar reorganized and the supply costs down by a figure that Evelyn had written in the household account book she'd started keeping in her precise, economical handwriting. The book lived in the kitchen drawer now, next to the supply records, and Caleb had taken to looking at it in the evenings the way he used to look at maps, not always finding answers, but locating where he was. Noah was reading, not fluently, not without effort, but he was reading, which was something the teacher at Iron Creek Schoolhouse had told Caleb last spring might take another year to come together, because Noah wasn't engaging, and engagement was the part no method could substitute for. He was engaging now. Evelyn had found a copy of Robinson Crusoe in the crate of books that had been sitting unopened under the bed in the front room since Thomas died. Thomas had been a reader, which was one of the things Caleb had loved about his brother, and also one of the things he'd felt least equipped to carry on. And she'd started reading it aloud to Noah after supper, stopping at the end of each chapter to ask him what he thought would happen next. Noah had opinions about Crusoe's decisions, about what he should have done differently, about whether stranding yourself on an island was the kind of problem you could have prevented. He'd started offering these opinions with increasing confidence, not just answering when asked, but inserting them into the reading, saying, "Wait, why would he?" or "That's wrong, he should." And Evelyn would stop and consider his argument with the seriousness it deserved, which sometimes meant telling him he was right, and sometimes meant explaining why Crusoe's situation was more complicated than it looked. And either way, Noah came away from it feeling that his thinking was worth something. Caleb sat in the chair by the stove and ostensibly did other things, mending, accounting, sharpening, and listened to all of it. He wasn't participating. He wasn't sure he'd been invited to participate, but he was present, which was its own thing, and the warmth in that room in the evenings, lamplit and quiet beneath the reading and Noah's occasional eruptions of opinion, was different from any warmth he'd felt in that house in a long time. It was on one of these evenings, a Tuesday in the 3rd week of October, that Evelyn stopped mid-chapter and said, "Someone's outside." Caleb looked up from the harness he was mending. "What?" "I heard something, at the south side of the house." She wasn't alarmed. She stated it the way she stated most things, as information, not as panic. He set the harness down and went to the window. The night was moonless, the kind of dark that the frontier did thoroughly. No ambient light, nothing softening the black outside. He could see nothing. He listened. Then he heard it. A sound that was almost nothing. A footfall, maybe on the frozen ground near the south wall. The sound something made when it was trying not to make a sound. "Stay here," he said. He took his rifle from the rack by the door. "Noah," Evelyn said, her voice level, "come sit by me." Noah moved without argument, which told Caleb the boy was frightened, because Noah's response to fear was compliance, not resistance. He pressed against Evelyn's side at the table, and she put her arm around him in a matter-of-fact way and kept her eyes on the door. Caleb went out the front and around the south side. It was Dale Runyon, not skulking, just standing at the south corner of the house near the cellar hatch, with his hands at his sides and the gray horse tied to the fence post 20 yards back. He turned when Caleb came around the corner and didn't flinch at the rifle, which told Caleb this visit had been planned and Runyon had thought through how it would go. "Caleb," Runyon said. "Dale." He kept the rifle low. "It's 9 o'clock at night. Mr. Crane wanted me to deliver something before the week was out." Runyon reached slowly into his coat, slowly, deliberately, both of them aware of the rifle, and produced an envelope. "Formal offer on the property. He asked me to give it to you direct." Caleb took the envelope without opening it. He could have mailed this. He preferred personal delivery. Thus, Runyon said it with the neutral professionalism of a man who carried messages he hadn't written and didn't comment on. "He said to tell you the offer is fair and the timeline is reasonable." The timeline. Offer's good through the end of November. After that, the implication was other options might be pursued. Other options meaning the assessment, meaning March, meaning the gap between what the revised tax bill required and what Caleb could produce. "Tell him I got it," Caleb said. Runyon nodded, untied his horse, and rode back into the dark. Caleb stood at the south corner of his house in the cold and looked at the envelope for a moment. Then he went back inside. Bolts. The number on Crane's offer was insultingly precise, not low enough to be obviously offensive, not high enough to be genuinely fair, calibrated exactly to the point where a man in serious difficulty might convince himself it was reasonable. It was the arithmetic of a person who had made this kind of calculation before and knew where the line was. Evelyn read the offer without commenting until she reached the last page, where the terms of transfer were listed. "He's including the water rights," she said. "It's one property. Water rights go with it." "No." She turned the page toward him and pointed. "He's specifying the water rights separately, here, in a clause that would give him control of the creek access even if the land transfer were ever contested or reversed." She looked at him. "That's not standard. That's someone making sure that even if he loses the land, he keeps what matters." Caleb looked at the clause. He could read well enough, had always been able to read, but legal language was its own dialect, and he didn't always catch the specific gravity of particular phrases. She apparently did. "Water rights," he said. "The creek runs through your east pasture and the Millard property and then into the lower valley. If Crane controls the access point..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Both of them understood what it meant for every operation downstream. "He's not just buying my land," Caleb said. "No," she said. "He's buying a lever." He sat back in his chair. The lamp was burning low again. He kept forgetting to fill it, which was a small failure he repeated regularly. And in the dimmer light, the offer on the table looked like what it was. A document designed to look like a solution while actually being a trap. "I'm not selling," he said. "I know." She folded the offer back into its envelope. "But you need documentation of that creek access going back as far as you can find it. If Crane challenges the assessment outcome, the water rights are going to be the next pressure point." "How do you know that?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because that's how my father's store ended," she said. "Not the debt. The debt was the excuse. It was the supply arrangement. Whoever controlled the dry goods chain into our county had leverage over every merchant, and my father had never documented his independent sourcing agreements. When the pressure came, he had nothing to show." He looked at her. This was more than she'd told him before, more than a closed door. This was the door slightly open, the edge of what she kept back. "I'm sorry," he said, "about your father's store." She accepted this with a small nod, not dismissing it, but not extending the moment either. Document the water rights, she said. Whatever you have, original deed, any correspondence with the land office, any agreements with the Millards. Find it all. He found it all over the next 2 days in the box of papers Thomas had kept in the office that Caleb had not opened since the funeral, because Thomas had been the one who understood where everything was, and Caleb had been putting off the work of learning the system. The papers were disorganized but thorough. Thomas had kept everything: receipts going back 12 years, land office correspondence, a copy of the original deed with the water access clause intact and specific. There were also 2 letters between Thomas and old Howard Millard from 1878, predating Crane's arrival in the county, establishing mutual access agreements that were handshake arrangements but were written down, which was better than most such things. Evelyn went through everything with him at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening while Noah slept, organizing it into a sequence she said would make sense to Flegg when he arrived, and also to the land office if it came to that. Your brother kept good records, she said. Thomas kept everything. He was... Caleb stopped. He was better at the paper side of it than I am. You're not bad at the paper side. You just don't like it. There's a difference? There's a significant difference. She added a letter to the stack. Not liking something means you can do it when it matters. Not being able to do something means something else. He thought about that. You're drawing a distinction to make me feel better. I'm drawing a distinction because it's accurate. She didn't look up. You read the assessment notice immediately and understood its implications. You read Crane's offer and caught that the number was calibrated. You didn't catch the water rights clause, but that's specific legal language and most people don't catch it. You caught it. I've seen it before. She straightened the stack and squared the edges. Different circumstances, same technique. He looked at the organized pile of papers that represented 12 years of his family's effort on this land, sorted and ordered now by a woman who had arrived 6 weeks ago with a broken bag and a knee she'd already stopped favoring. Evelyn, he said. She looked up. I don't know how to... He stopped, started again. The thing you're doing here. What you've been doing since you arrived. I don't have a word for it. She held his gaze for a moment, and something in her face did the thing it sometimes did. Not quite closing, but going careful, the way a person goes careful with something they've been hurt by before. You don't need a word for it, she said. It's just work. It's not just work. She looked at the papers. No, she said after a moment. But it's easier to call it that. He understood that. He left it where she'd put it. Orson Flegg arrived on the 4th of November, 2 days late due to a road delay outside of Billings that he explained briefly and without apology. He was a small, precise man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the slightly distracted manner of someone who spent most of his time thinking about measurements. He shook Caleb's hand, shook Evelyn's hand with the same lack of ceremony, accepted coffee, and spent 3 minutes with Thomas's documents before saying they were better than what he usually had to work with. He spent 2 full days on the land, moving with his instruments across the boundaries while Caleb kept up with the ranch work, and Evelyn kept the household, and Noah trailed Flegg at a respectful distance, watching the surveying equipment with the focused attention he gave anything mechanical or precise. On the evening of the second day, Flegg sat at the kitchen table and showed them his findings. The 1879 survey had a boundary error on the eastern edge, not large but real, and the error ran in Caleb's favor, meaning the assessed land area used for the tax calculation was slightly smaller than the actual property. Additionally, Flegg had documented the creek access point and the water rights boundary in a way that was explicit and geometrically specific, the kind of documentation that made subsequent challenges difficult. He would file a corrected survey with the land office within the week. What does the corrected area do to the assessment? Evelyn asked. Changes the base figure by approximately 9%. Flegg said it without drama. Not enormous, but meaningful on the current rate. He adjusted his glasses. More importantly, it creates a clear record. If there are further disputes about the property's boundaries or usage rights, the 1883 Flegg survey supersedes the 1879 document. Crane's people will push back, Caleb said. They're entitled to commission their own survey. Flegg capped his pen. They'll find the same numbers. Good boundary work doesn't change by who's measuring. After Fleeg left the following morning, Caleb stood on the porch in the cold and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, which was that a thing had been done correctly and it was going to hold. It was a specific feeling, different from relief, less complicated than hope, more like the feeling of a fence post properly set. Not exciting, just solid. He heard the door behind him and Evelyn came out with her coat on and stood beside him, looking at the east pasture. 9%, he said. And a record. And a record. He watched a hawk quarter over the far tree line. He's going to come at it another way. He will, she agreed. But each time he does, there's a record of that too. She had her arms folded against the cold, not dramatically, just practically. Crane's mistake is that he thinks the only things that matter are what he can do. He's not accounting for what gets written down. You think paperwork beats a man with that kind of money? I think paperwork is the only thing that consistently beats a man with that kind of money. She said it with a certainty that came from somewhere specific, somewhere she'd been. Violence goes to whoever's bigger, money goes to whoever has more, but documentation goes to whoever kept better records. He thought about Thomas's papers. He thought about the shoebox full of letters and receipts that Thomas had maintained with the care of a man who believed that what you wrote down mattered, that the act of recording something was itself a form of commitment to its truth. Thomas would have liked you, Caleb said. He didn't mean to say it. It came out the way things come out when you stop managing what you're saying, when the thought is true enough that it finds the gap before you can close it. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was slightly different from its usual register. Not soft exactly, more like the way a sound changes when the room it's in changes. Tell me about him, she said. So he did. Standing on the porch in the November cold, watching the hawk drift and turn, he told her about Thomas, about the way his brother had read everything he could get hold of and remembered all of it, about how he'd been better with people than Caleb had ever managed, how he'd been the one who could walk into a room and make the temperature change, not by being loud, but by being genuinely present in a way that most people couldn't sustain. He told her about the winter Thomas died, the fever that came on fast and got bad faster, the way the doctor from Billings hadn't arrived in time, the way Caleb had sat with his brother for 40 hours and then been alone in a house with an 8-year-old who didn't yet understand that alone meant permanently. Evelyn listened. She didn't insert herself into the story or redirect it or try to give it a shape that would make it easier to hear. She just listened, and when he was done, she stayed quiet for a moment in the way that honored the weight of what had been said. He sounds like someone worth missing, she said. Yes, Caleb said. That's exactly what he is. The cattle thieves announced themselves the way trouble often did on the frontier, not all at once, but in stages, small signs that could be explained away until they couldn't. The first sign was 3 steers missing from the north pasture on a Monday morning in mid-November. Caleb had checked the fence line and found nothing wrong with it, which meant the animals had either drifted through a gap he hadn't found or been walked out, and drifting steers left different marks than walked ones. He looked for marks. He found boot prints near the north gate, 2 sets, and the print of a horse that had been standing a while, the kind of waiting an animal did when held by someone doing something that took time. He told Evelyn that evening. He told it without embellishment. 3 steers, boot prints, a stationary horse. She was quiet for a moment. How many head total are you running? 43 now, was 46. And 3 gone in one night. Yes. That's not casual, she said. Someone walked out 3 steers in the dark without disturbing the others and without breaking your fence. That's someone who knows cattle work. He'd thought the same thing. Ranch hands, maybe. Drifters who'd worked cattle enough to know how. Or, and this was the thought he'd been pushing around all day without quite landing on it, someone who'd been watching the operation long enough to know which animals to take and how to move them without commotion. Dale Runyon knows cattle work, he said. She looked at him. That's a serious thing to say. I know it is. Do you have anything more than the prints? Not yet. She thought for a moment. Then say nothing. Document what you have, the prints, the count, the date. Write it down tonight while it's clear. She paused. And we need to watch the north pasture. We, he said, for the second time since she'd arrived. "You have 40 remaining cattle and a man who wants your land and water rights," she said, with the particular patience of someone repeating logic they've already worked through completely. "Yes, we." They watched the north pasture in shifts over the following week. Caleb taking the earlier hours and Evelyn taking the later ones, an arrangement she'd proposed and he'd resisted for exactly 30 seconds before accepting, because the alternative was him staying awake all night every night, which served no one. She sat in the barn's upper loft with a view of the north gate and a wool blanket, and no complaint about either the cold or the hours. Noah knew something was happening. He was 8, not oblivious, and he'd grown up on this land and understood its rhythms well enough to notice when the adults were moving differently through the days. He didn't ask directly. That wasn't his way. But he stopped going to bed at his usual time and started appearing in the kitchen at 9, 10 o'clock, pretending to need water. On the third night of this, Evelyn, coming back in from the barn at midnight, found him at the kitchen table with his charcoal and his paper and the lamp turned very low. "You should be in bed," she said. "I know." She sat down across from him. She was cold from the barn. Her hands showed it, and she wrapped them around the cup she'd left on the stove, the coffee gone tepid. "Noah." He looked up. "If something happened to this ranch," she said carefully, "what would you want to have done?" He thought about it in the serious way he thought about things, not performing seriousness but actually working through it. "Stayed," he said finally. "I'd want to have stayed and done something." "Then go to bed and sleep," she said, "so you're not tired if we need you." He looked at her for a moment. He went to bed. On the 5th night, they came. Caleb was at the north gate when he heard the horses, 3 of them, coming from the tree line to the northwest, moving at the slow, deliberate pace of animals being held quiet by practiced hands. He flattened against the fence post and watched them resolve out of the dark. 3 riders in dark coats and hats pulled low, with a 4th man on foot already at the gate working the latch. He fired once into the air. The reaction was instant. The horses spooked, the man at the gate dropped it, and for 3 seconds it was pure noise and motion. Then one of the riders got his horse under control, and Caleb heard a voice say, "There's only one of them. Go!" And the man on foot came at the gate again. The second shot came from the barn loft, not into the air, at the ground, 3 feet in front of the man at the gate, which was exactly as close as you could shoot to a person in the dark without risking them. The crack of it was flat and enormous in the night, and the man at the gate jumped back like he'd been burned. "I will not miss twice," Evelyn said from the loft. She said it at a normal conversational volume, which was somehow more frightening than if she'd shouted it. The man at the gate looked up at the barn. He looked at Caleb. He took 2 steps backward. That was when they heard the horses from the south road. Not the thieves' horses, different horses, coming fast, and with them a light, a lantern swinging on a pole, and a voice Caleb recognized as Pete Garza, shouting something that got lost in the noise. 3 men came up the south road on horseback, Pete and 2 of the Millard hands from the neighboring property, who had apparently seen the first signal shot and understood it for what it was, because that was what the first shot into the air meant in this county, had meant for 20 years. The man at the gate was gone. 2 of the mounted riders were already retreating into the tree line. The 3rd rider's horse had thrown him, and he was on the ground with Caleb's rifle pointed at him and no particular options. The whole thing had taken less than 4 minutes. Pete Garza tied the man on the ground. His name, as it turned out, was Vic Slade, and he was known to the county sheriff's office in a general way, the kind of general way that meant there was paperwork on him, and looked up at the barn loft and then at Caleb. "Who's shooting from your barn?" Pete said. "Evelyn," Caleb said. Pete looked at the barn loft again, where Evelyn was climbing down the ladder with the rifle over her arm, moving carefully and without hurry, her wool blanket left behind in the loft. "Huh," Pete said. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" one of the Millard hands asked her when she reached the ground. She checked the rifle's action before answering, which was the kind of thing a person did if they'd been taught to do it properly. "My father," she said. "He believed in accuracy over frequency." She handed the rifle back to Caleb. "The other 2 are in the northwest tree line. They won't go far tonight. Their horses are unsettled, and it's dark. How do you know? Pete said. Because they came for cattle, not for trouble. The cattle are still here. They'll want to try again before they give up and move on. She looked at Caleb. You should send word to the sheriff tonight. I'll go, Pete said. Thank you, Pete. She said it without excess feeling, just directly, because that was how she said things. Caleb stood in the dark of his north pasture with the rifle in his hand and Vic Slade tied on the ground, and Pete Garza already heading for his horse, and the Millard men talking quietly near the gate. And he looked at Evelyn standing 3 feet away, her hair down from the pins that hadn't survived the barn loft, her coat dusty, her face in the lantern light showing nothing he could read clearly except a kind of settled steadiness that wasn't calm exactly, more like a person who had been frightened and decided to do the thing anyway and was now on the other side of it. You said you'd not miss twice, he said. I had a clear line on the gate from the second rafter. She looked at him. I wasn't going to let them take the cattle. You weren't going to let... He stopped. Evelyn, this wasn't your fight. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not hurt, something more complicated than either. Something that was the face a person made when someone said something that was technically true, but wrong in a way that was hard to explain without saying things they weren't ready to say. When did it stop being my fight? She said. He didn't have an answer for that. She turned and walked back toward the house, and after a moment he followed, and the lantern light swung behind them, and in the house, in the kitchen, Noah was sitting at the table. Not pretending to need water this time, just sitting. And when he heard them come in, he looked up at the door and his whole body did the thing a body does when it releases something it's been holding, the slight settling of the shoulders, the exhale. You're both okay, he said. It wasn't a question. We're both okay, Evelyn said. She hung her coat and went to the stove because the fire needed banking and the night was cold and there were still things that needed doing, the same as always, even after everything. Noah looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him. Outside, Pete Garza's horse was already moving down the south road, carrying word of Vic Slade and the northwest tree line to whoever needed to know it, and the cattle were quiet in the north pasture, and the gate was shut and the fence held. Come here, Caleb said to Noah. The boy came and Caleb put his arm around him, which was something he didn't do enough. He knew that, had always known it, but knowing something and doing it were the kind of gap that life on the frontier widened without your noticing. He held his nephew against his side, and Noah pressed in without embarrassment, 8 years old and frightened and trying not to be. And over the top of his head, Caleb looked at Evelyn at the stove, and she glanced back at him once, briefly, and then looked away. He thought about what she'd said. When did it stop being my fight? He thought about the answer he didn't have, and the reason he didn't have it, which was that there was no good answer because she was right. Because somewhere in the past 6 weeks, in the list with the stars in the margin, the chalk marks on the door frames, the coffee stronger than his, the reading aloud from Robinson Crusoe, the surveyor's letter, the organized papers, the shot fired 3 feet in front of a man trying to take his cattle in the dark. Somewhere in all of that, this had stopped being a practical arrangement between strangers and become something he didn't have a clean word for, the same way he hadn't had a clean word for what she'd been doing since she arrived. He'd told her the words would come when he was sure. He was starting to be sure. He didn't say it. He stood in his kitchen with his nephew under his arm and the fire banking down and the woman who had arrived with nothing moving around his house like she'd always been the reason the house worked. And he stayed quiet, because some things deserved to be said right. And right took a little longer than tonight. Vic Slade talked, not immediately and not willingly, but by the following afternoon he had talked, because the Glacier County Sheriff was a practical man named Holt, who had been doing this work for 16 years and understood that a man in Slade's position, caught, tied, facing charges in a county where cattle theft carried serious weight, had exactly one card to play, which was information, and that card lost value every hour he held on to it. Slade gave up 2 names. Neither of them was Dale Runyon, which Caleb had half expected, and neither of them was anyone directly connected to Aldous Crane, which he had also half expected. They were drifters, hired hands who'd been working their way west and had been approached by someone in Billings 2 months ago with an offer. Specific ranch, specific herd, specific nights to move. The someone in Billings had a name Slade claimed not to know, which Sheriff Holt said was probably true, and also probably didn't matter because the trail between a hired cattle thief and the man who commissioned the job was deliberately long and had gaps in it by design. Caleb sat in Holt's office on the morning of the second day and listened to all of this and said, "So nothing connects back to Crane." "Nothing I can put on paper," Holt said. He was a spare, careful man with a gray mustache and the unhurried manner of someone who'd made peace with the limits of what evidence could prove. "What I can do is document the attempt, document Slade's account of the commission, file it with the territorial office, and make sure it's in the record." He looked at Caleb over his desk. "Someone looking at this property in the future is going to find a record of a documented theft attempt and a documented land assessment dispute, both occurring in the same 60-day window. That tells a story, even without a name on it." Evelyn said documentation was the only thing that consistently beat a man with that kind of money, Caleb said. Holt looked at him for a moment. "Smart woman." "Yes," Caleb said. "She is." He drove back to the ranch in the early afternoon under a sky that had gone the flat gray of incoming snow, the mountains invisible behind cloud, the air smelling like iron. The first real snow of winter. He'd been watching for it for a week. He needed to get the remaining fence work done on the west pasture before it came and made the ground too hard to drive posts, and he had a section of the barn wall that Evelyn had marked with her chalk. 2 circles, which meant urgent, that needed planking before the temperature dropped further. He was thinking about the fence when he came over the last rise and saw the ranch spread below him and stopped thinking about the fence. There were 2 wagons in the yard that hadn't been there when he left. Pete Garza's wagon he recognized. The second one belonged to Howard Millard's son James, who had taken over the neighboring property 2 years ago, and who Caleb knew well enough to work alongside, but hadn't considered a close neighbor in the way that meant showing up uninvited. He came into the yard and found the reason for both wagons. Pete was on the barn wall with 2 planks, fitting them to the gap Evelyn had marked, while James Millard held the boards from below at the right angle. Evelyn was on the ground with the nail box, handing up nails at the right moment, not directing anyone, just being the person who made the next thing possible. On the far side of the barn, out of the way but close enough to watch, Noah sat on the fence rail with his charcoal and paper, recording something. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop and looked at all of this for a long moment. "What's happening?" he said. Pete looked down from the barn wall. "Barn wall," he said, as though this were obvious. "I can see that. Why are you—" "Because it needs doing before the snow comes, and I'm not busy today." Pete held out his hand for a nail without looking down, and Evelyn placed one in it. "Also, your woman wrote to half the county." Caleb looked at Evelyn. "You wrote to half the county." She looked back at him without apology. "I wrote to Pete and to James Millard. That's 2 people." Pete said half the county. Pete exaggerates. She picked up 2 more nails from the box. The barn wall was on the list. The list needed to be shorter before the snow. "I had 2 people who owed the ranch goodwill after the other night." She said it the way she said most practical things, not defensively, just as a sequence of facts that led logically to a conclusion. So I asked. Well, James Millard from below the planks said, "She also sent cornbread." "I had cornmeal," Evelyn said. Caleb climbed down from the wagon and stood in his own yard feeling something he didn't quite have a name for. Not surprise exactly, because he'd stopped being fully surprised by her about 3 weeks ago. Something more like the accumulated weight of many small things that had been building without his accounting for them, arriving all at once in the image of his barn wall being fixed by 2 neighbors who'd shown up because she'd asked and sent cornbread. He changed his clothes and got up on the barn wall with Pete, and they worked until the light started going, the 4 of them and Noah, who handed tools when asked and didn't need to be managed about it, and by the time the first snow came down, light, exploratory, the kind that was feeling out the situation before committing, the barn wall was planked and sealed, and Pete and James Millard were in the kitchen drinking coffee at the table that had started the year as a place where a man and a boy ate in silence. It was not silent now. Pete was telling a story about a horse he'd tried to buy in Billings last spring, and the man who'd sold it to him and then immediately tried to buy it back at a higher price. And James was adding details that suggested he'd heard this story before but found it worth hearing again. And Noah was at his end of the table with his paper, which Caleb could now see was a drawing of the barn with the planked wall, done with the kind of careful attention to proportion that was new, that had developed over the past 6 weeks in parallel with everything else. Evelyn stood at the stove and listened to Pete's story and added at exactly the right moment, "Did you buy it back?" And Pete said, "I did not." And everyone at the table laughed, and she smiled at the stove with her back to all of them, the smile she didn't quite show people directly. Caleb watched her from the doorway and thought, right, just that. The word landing in him with the particular quiet of a thing that had been true for a while and was only now being acknowledged. Right. Pete left at dark. James Millard stayed another half hour, talking to Caleb on the porch about the water situation in the lower valley and what Flaig's survey documentation meant for the Millard property's eastern access, which was a related question, and Caleb told him what he knew about the filing and what Holt had said about the record. And James listened in the serious way he had and said, "My father always said the Voss land was the hinge. Whatever happened there happened to us eventually. Your father was right. He usually was." James looked out at the first proper snow coming down steadily now, turning the yard white. "You held it. So far. So far is enough for tonight." James shook his hand and got in his wagon. Caleb stood on the porch until the wagon was gone, the snow covering its tracks almost as fast as it made them. Then he went back inside. Noah was in bed. The kitchen was clean, cleaner than he'd left it, which meant Evelyn had washed up after Pete and James without appearing to make a production of it. The lamp was full for once, and he realized she must have filled it while he was on the porch, the same way she noticed the things that needed doing and did them in the gaps between other things without announcing it. She was sitting at the table with the account book open and the week's figures in front of her. This was her end-of-week habit. She did the accounts on Friday evenings, and she showed him the result and explained what had moved and why, and he'd started looking forward to it in a way that had nothing to do with the figures. He sat down across from her. She pushed the book toward him. "Barn wall came in under what I'd budgeted for the repair," she said, "because Pete brought his own nails." He looked at the figure. "We should pay him back." "I already thought about that. Not money. He wouldn't take it. But his youngest daughter is the one who has trouble with figures, same as Clara Schultz. I thought I could offer to include her in the sessions." She paused. "If you think that's appropriate." "Why wouldn't it be appropriate?" She looked at the table for a moment. "I'm still—" She stopped, tried again. "I'm not sure of the edges of what I'm permitted to arrange independently." He understood what she meant. She was describing the boundary of her position, what she was entitled to do as a practical arrangement, what required his agreement, what was hers, and what was his. It was a careful distinction, and it told him she'd been thinking about it, which told him she was uncertain about it. He didn't like that she was uncertain. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. "There's something I want to say, and I want to say it right, so I'm going to be slow about it." She waited. She was good at waiting. "When I wrote to the agency," he said, "I was writing to solve a problem. I need to be honest about that. I was losing the ranch, and I had a child who wasn't doing well, and I was—" He paused. "I was doing the math. The way you do the math when you're trying to figure out how to survive." She nodded once, not interrupting. "I thought you'd come and you'd manage the house and help with Noah, and I'd work the cattle end, and we'd be a functional operation, and that was what I was aiming for." He looked at his hands on the table. "A functional operation." "I know," she said. "That's what I came for, too." "I know it is." He looked at her. "But it's not what happened." She held his gaze. She didn't look away from it, and she didn't fill the silence, which was one of the things about her that had disassembled him slowly over 10 weeks. "What happened," he said, "is that you showed up, and you fixed the floor in your own bedroom without telling me, and you wrote to a surveyor before I thought to, and you sat in my barn loft in the cold for a week waiting for cattle thieves, and you made my nephew laugh." He stopped. "And I would very much like you to stop thinking about the edges of what you're permitted to arrange. Because I want you to arrange things. I want you here, not as a practical arrangement, as—" He stopped again. He'd planned this better in his head. In his head it had been more ordered. "I'm saying this badly," he said. "You're saying it fine," she said, and her voice was slightly different from its usual register, the way it had been when he told her about Thomas. "I'm asking you to stay," he said, "past any arrangement, past any agreement that has terms to it." He kept his eyes on hers. "I'm asking because I want you beside me. Not because we need the help, though we do. Not because of Noah, though what you've done for him." He stopped, because that part was going to cost him, and he hadn't planned for that. "Because it's you. Because you're the most honest person I've been in a room with in years, and because you see things clearly and say them, and because when you're not here, I notice the difference, and when you are here, this house is what it's supposed to be." He'd said more than he planned. He generally said less than he planned, so this was unusual, and he felt it the way you feel something that has cost you, but that you don't regret spending. Evelyn sat across from him with her hands flat on the table and looked at him for a long moment. And what was in her face was not the closed-door expression, and not the careful measuring expression, and not the working through logistics expression. It was something else. Something that looked like the face a person made when they'd been carrying a weight for a long time and someone had finally seen it and not looked away. "I'm not easy," she said. "I know that. I have opinions about supply costs and fence posts, and I'll tell you when you're wrong. I count on it. I'm not—" She looked down at her hands. "I came here with nothing, Caleb. Whatever I've built since I got here, I built here. I don't have family to come from, or a name that means anything in this county, or money of my own, or—" "Stop," he said. She looked up. "You showed up on a train platform in broken boots and built everything in this house worth having in 10 weeks. He said it plainly, because it was plain. "I don't care what you came with. I care what you are." She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the lamp flickered and steadied, and the snow outside made the particular silence that snow made, the muffled world quiet of a house held inside winter. "I'd like to stay," she said finally. "Not because I need to." She looked at him directly. "Because this is where I want to be." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and her hand turned under his and held it, and they sat like that for a while in the kitchen they had rebuilt together, neither of them saying anything more, because the thing that had been building since a woman climbed up from the platform boards on a Tuesday in September had said enough for one night. They were married in December, 2 weeks before Christmas, in the most practical ceremony the frontier offered. The circuit judge came through Iron Creek on his regular route, and Caleb and Evelyn signed the papers in Judge Reardon's temporary office above the dry goods store, with Pete Garza and Helena Crane as witnesses. Helena Crane had insisted on being a witness. She had, in fact, announced it 3 weeks prior as though it were already decided, which it more or less was, because no one who knew Helena Crane was under the illusion that she announced things she didn't intend. She arrived at the dry goods store in her good coat and her sharpest expression, and shook Caleb's hand once and looked at Evelyn for a moment and said, "You're sure about him?" And Evelyn said, "I am." And Helena said, "Good. He needed someone to be sure about him. He's been muddling along." "Helena?" Pete said. "It's a compliment," Helena said. "Muddling along is better than giving up. He didn't give up." She sat down. "Sign the papers." Noah stood at Caleb's right side in his good shirt, which Evelyn had mended 2 nights ago, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with her needle and a piece of thread she'd matched carefully to the fabric, her head bent in the lamplight in the way she bent her head when she was concentrating, and Noah had sat across from her and watched and said nothing, because some things didn't need words. He watched Judge Reardon work through the papers with the focused attention of a child who understood that something permanent was happening. When Caleb signed, Noah looked at the paper. When Evelyn signed, he looked at the paper again. When Reardon announced that the thing was done, Noah turned to Evelyn and said, "Is it different now?" She considered this seriously. "Some things are," she said. "Some things were already what they were." He thought about that. "The chalk marks are still on the door frames," he offered. "They are." "That's the same." "Yes." "And you'll still read on Friday nights." "If you want." He turned back to the front of the room and stood up straight with his hands at his sides. And Caleb, looking at him, saw something in his nephew's face that he had not seen in 2 years and 2 months. Not happiness exactly, which was too large and simple a word, but the specific expression of a child who has decided that the ground is solid enough to stand on. That was the thing. That was the thing that cost Caleb in the place behind his sternum that grief had worn open, standing in the dry goods store's upstairs room with snow on the window and Helena Crane straightening her coat and Pete blinking too much. He reached down and put his hand on Noah's shoulder, and Noah leaned into it, and Evelyn stood beside them both and looked at the judge's paperwork with the practical attention of a woman who checked documents for errors and found none, and was satisfied. But the assessment notice from the land office came in February, 6 weeks after Fleeg's corrected survey had been filed. The revised figure was 14% lower than the original disputed amount, not 9 as Fleeg had estimated, because the boundary correction had been accepted in full and the water rights documentation had added a usage classification that further adjusted the calculation. It was not a number that resolved all difficulty, but it was a number Caleb could meet by March 15th, which was the deadline, which was what mattered. He read the notice at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning. He set it down and didn't say anything for a moment. Evelyn was at the stove. Noah was in the other room. 14%, he said. She turned from the stove. He held the notice up. She came and read it over his shoulder, one hand on the back of his chair, and he felt her go still in the way she went still when something resolved the way she'd calculated it should. The water rights classification, she said. Fleeg said 9%. It came in at 14. Because they accepted the water rights argument. She straightened. I didn't expect that. I thought they'd contest the classification. They didn't. She went back to the stove. He watched her. The set of her shoulders, the slight change in how she was standing, the thing that happened to her when something worked that she'd reasoned through. You're not surprised it worked, he said. You're surprised it worked that well. The principle was sound. The margin was uncertain. She turned something in the pan. I'm pleased about the margin. You're allowed to be more than pleased. She glanced back at him. I'm very pleased. He laughed. He didn't do it often enough, hadn't done it in so long before she came that he'd forgotten the specific quality of it, the way it surprised you from inside. She turned back to the stove, and he could see the edge of something on her face that wasn't quite her smile, but was adjacent to it. Noah appeared in the doorway. What's funny? The government, Caleb said. Noah considered this. That's not usually funny. Usually not, Caleb agreed. Today it is. Crane came himself in March. Not Runyon this time, not a letter, not a land office notice generated by someone he knew but couldn't prove he knew. Aldous Crane Chietsochain arrived at the Voss Ranch on a Thursday afternoon in the last week of winter, when the snow was still on the ground but the light had changed, gone longer and slightly warmer in the way that happened before the thaw, and he came alone, which was either a concession or a statement, and Caleb wasn't sure which. He was, as Caleb remembered him from the platform, silver-haired, precisely dressed, the kind of man who communicated money without appearing to try. He rode a black horse that was well-kept and probably expensive, and he dismounted in the yard and looked at the house and then at the barn and took his time with both, which was its own kind of message. Caleb met him in the yard. He had the rifle in the house and the paperwork in the kitchen drawer, and the assessment paid last week and Fleeg's survey filed with the territorial office in Billings as well as the county office, a redundancy Evelyn had suggested because 2 copies in 2 places was harder to make disappear than 1 copy in one. Voss, Crane said. Crane. Caleb didn't offer his hand. They both understood the nature of this visit. Crane looked at the barn again. You've done work here. We have. The survey thing. Crane said it the way a man said a thing he found inconvenient but not catastrophic. Your woman thought of that. She did. Smart. He said it without warmth or approval, just as a factual acknowledgement, the way you acknowledged a move that had cost you something. He looked at Caleb. The offer is off the table. You know that. I wasn't going to take it. I know. Crane adjusted the glove on his left hand, a gesture Caleb recognized as the thing this man did when he was choosing his next words. The water rights documentation changes the downstream picture. I have lawyers who disagree with Flagg's classification. It'll likely go back through the land office. Probably, Caleb said. We'll file the response when it does. We have the Millard letters from 1878. We have the original deed language. We have Flagg's methodology, which is documented and can be defended. We have the copy in Billings. He said this the way she'd told him to say it, if it came to this, not aggressively, not in a way that invited escalation, just stating what existed. It's in a lot of places. Crane was quiet for a moment. You didn't used to be this organized, he said. No, Caleb agreed. I wasn't. The front door of the house opened and Evelyn came out onto the porch. She had flour on her hands from whatever she'd been doing, which she hadn't bothered to wipe off, and she looked at Crane with the same direct, measuring expression she'd had on that train platform in September, the same one she gave the camera in the photograph, the one that didn't perform anything. Crane looked at her. She looked back at him. She didn't say anything. She just stood there on the porch of the house she'd repaired and looked at the man who'd knocked her to the platform boards and called her that and stepped over her like something to be cleared. And the looking was enough. Crane looked away first. He got back on his horse. He sat for a moment, not saying anything, looking at the property the way he'd looked at it when he arrived. The house, the barn, the east pasture visible through the gate, the fence line solid and correct. Water rights will stay complicated, he said. Most things do, Caleb said. Crane turned the black horse and rode back down the road, and Caleb watched him go until he was gone from sight, and then he turned and looked at Evelyn on the porch. You heard that? He said. I heard enough. He'll be back at it, the lawyers. I know. She came down the porch steps, brushing the flour from her hands, but he came himself this time, which means the letters and the survey scared him enough to make the trip. He wanted to see what we had. She looked down the road where Crane had gone. And now he's seen. And? She looked at him. And we have more than he expected. She turned back to the house. Supper's in an hour. The west fence needs the post reset before the ground thaws soft. I know. You said you'd do it Thursday. It's Thursday. Then you have an hour. She went back up the porch steps and through the door. He stood in the yard for a moment, alone in the thin March sunlight, the ground still hard underfoot, the mountains clear and enormous to the west, the ranch spread around him in the state he was slowly learning to call. Not saved, not safe, because those words were too simple, and the frontier didn't honor simple, but held by work and documentation, and a woman who stood on a porch with flour on her hands and looked at a powerful man until he looked away. He went to get the post hole digger. That evening, after supper, after Noah was in bed with Robinson Crusoe, he was reading it himself now, slowly, with his finger under the words and his brow furrowed in the way he concentrated, coming out of his room occasionally to ask about a word he couldn't parse. Caleb and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the account book between them, which was their Friday habit moved to Thursday because the week had been what it had been. The figures were better than last year. Not good. Good was still ahead, still something to work toward, but better, and the trajectory was right, and the Billings bank debt had come down by a figure that was small in absolute terms and significant in what it meant, which was that the direction had changed. Evelyn closed the book. She sat with her hands around her coffee cup and looked at nothing in particular, which was unusual for her. She generally looked at whatever she was thinking about. What? He said. She was quiet for a moment. I keep waiting, she said, for the thing that ends it. He looked at her. What thing? I don't know. That's what I keep waiting to find out. She looked at her coffee. Everything good thing I've had before, there's been a point where it stopped. She paused. I've gotten careful about good things. I assume they come with a clock. He thought about what to say to that. He thought about saying the obvious thing, that this was different, that it would hold, that she didn't have to keep waiting. He decided not to say any of that, because she was too honest a person to be given easy reassurances, and she'd know the difference. I can't promise you there's no clock, he said. There's always something. That's the frontier. That's anywhere. He looked at her. What I can tell you is what I've seen. 10 weeks ago, this place was going under. The house was cold in the wrong ways. Noah hadn't talked to anyone in months. I was keeping up, not building. He paused. Now Crane came and looked at what we have, and he looked away first. That's because of what you did. That's documented and filed and in 2 offices, and it's not going away because you leave. He held her gaze. But I'd like you to stay anyway. She looked at him for a long time. I already did stay, she said. We signed papers. I know. I'm telling you why I'm glad you did. He picked up his coffee. There's a difference. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite the smile that lived at the edge of things, a little more than that, a little more visible. There is a difference, she said. Outside, the March wind pushed at the house, the same wind that had pushed at it all winter, and the house took it the same way it always had. Not without feeling it, but standing anyway, the repairs holding, the boards sound, the gap sealed against whatever came next. Inside, the lamp was full. Noah's voice came through the wall, reading to himself about a man alone on an island, learning what he was made of one day at a time, figuring out slowly that survival and living were not the same thing, and that the difference between them was whether you were building something or just enduring. Evelyn heard it and looked at the wall with the expression she had when Noah didn't know she was watching him. Careful, private, the face of a woman who had been alone in a different way than Caleb had been alone, who had rebuilt herself in a place with no walls before she came here and started building them alongside someone else. He saw it. He looked away before she caught him looking, because some things deserved their privacy. He drank his coffee. She turned back to the table. The wind moved around the outside of the house and found no purchase, and the night settled in around them, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and neither of them needed to. The lawyers Crane sent were from Billings, 2 of them, and they arrived in April with a counterfiling that challenged Fleeg's water rights classification on the grounds that the 1878 Millard letters constituted informal correspondence rather than legally binding access agreements. It was a reasonable argument. Caleb read the counterfiling at the kitchen table with the particular heaviness of a man who had allowed himself to believe briefly that a thing was resolved and was now being reminded that nothing on the frontier resolved cleanly. Evelyn read it after him. She read it twice, which she did when something required more than one pass. And when she set it down, her expression was not defeated. It was the expression of someone recalculating. They're not wrong about the letters, she said. I know. Informal correspondence is a legitimate challenge. Reardon would probably agree with the framing. She was quiet for a moment. But they're arguing the wrong document. He looked at her. The letters establish intent, she said, but they're not the binding instrument. The binding instrument is the original deed which specifies creek access as appurtenant to the property. She turned back to the first page of the counterfiling. They're not challenging the deed language. They're challenging the letters, which is easier, but it's the wrong target. She looked up. Fleet's classification is tied to the deed, not the letters. The letters are supporting evidence, not the foundation. Caleb sat back. Can you put that in writing? I'm not a lawyer. You understand this better than I do. That's a low bar. She said it without malice, just honestly. We need someone who can file a formal response, but I can write the argument and someone qualified can put it in proper language. She paused. Helena Crane's late husband used a lawyer in Great Falls. She mentioned him. Not Billings, Great Falls, which means he doesn't have existing relationships with Crane's people. He looked at her. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about this since February, she said. When Crane said the lawyers disagreed with Fleeg's classification, I knew it was coming. She was matter-of-fact about it, not proud, not performing foresight. I just didn't know which angle they'd use. He got up from the table and went to the window and looked out at the April yard. The snow gone now, except in the shadows of the barn's north wall, the ground soft and beginning to show the green that meant the season had actually turned. He thought about what it had cost to get here, not in money, though that had been real enough, but in the other currencies, the ones that didn't show in account books. The nights, the weight of it, the particular exhaustion of fighting a thing that kept finding new shapes. Write the argument, he said. I'll find out about the Great Falls lawyer. His name is Aldridge, she said. I already asked Helena. He turned from the window. He wasn't surprised. He'd stopped being surprised, which was its own kind of gift she'd given him without meaning to. The gift of being a person who was always a step further along than he expected. "Of course you did," he said. Evelyn's written argument ran to 4 pages, set out in the same precise handwriting as the household account book. And when Caleb read it, he understood the shape of it, even where he didn't know the specific legal terms, because she'd written it the way she did most things, clearly, without ornamentation, in the order that made the logic visible. He sent it to Aldridge in Great Falls, along with the deed, the Fleeg survey, and the counterfiling. Aldridge wrote back in 10 days. He said the argument was substantially correct, that the deed language was the binding instrument and the letters were immaterial to Fleeg's classification, and that he could file a formal response for $35 and expected the land office to rule in Caleb's favor within 60 days. $35 was $35. Caleb looked at the account book and then at the figure for the Billings debt and then at the spring calf count, which was better than last year's by 6 head, and he wrote back to Aldridge with a bank draft and a thank you that he kept brief because Aldridge seemed like a man who appreciated brevity. The land office ruling came in June. 43 days, not 60. The water rights classification stood as filed. Crane's challenge was noted and denied. Caleb read the ruling on a Wednesday morning in the barn, where he'd been checking a calf that had been slow to nurse. He read it once. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and went back to the calf, because the calf needed attention, and the ruling would still be the ruling when the calf was sorted. And the frontier had taught him early that the order of things mattered more than the feeling of them. He told Evelyn that evening. He told it plain. Ruling came. Classification stands. Crane's challenge denied. She was at the kitchen table with Noah, working through a multiplication problem that Noah had gotten wrong twice and was working on a 3rd time with the focused stubbornness of a child who didn't like being wrong. She looked up when Caleb said it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at Noah's paper and said, "Try it from the other direction. Start with the larger number." Noah tried it from the other direction. He got it right. "There," she said. He looked at his paper. "That's the same answer I got the first time." "Then the first time was right. You just weren't sure." She moved his paper back in front of him. Being right and being sure aren't the same thing. You can be right before you know you are. Caleb stood in the doorway and looked at the two of them and thought about that. Being right before you know you are. He thought about September, the platform, the woman on her hands and knees who was already getting up before anyone moved to help her. He thought about all the things she'd been right about before he knew enough to recognize it. The surveyor, the deed language, the cornbread for Pete, the shot fired 3 feet in front of a man at a gate. He'd been right to write to the agency. He hadn't known it the way he knew it now, but he'd been right. "Good news?" Noah said, not looking up from his paper. "Good news," Caleb said. Noah nodded, satisfied, and started on the next problem. Crane made one more attempt in August. It came not as lawyers or land office filings, but as an offer to James Millard, a purchase of the Millard property's eastern section, which would have given Crane a parcel adjacent to the Voss Creek access point, making the water rights question practically complicated even if it was legally settled. It was a shrewd move, the kind that acknowledged a lost legal argument while finding a different door. James Millard told Crane he'd think about it. He came to Caleb 2 days later and told him about the offer, which was also the kind of man James was, straightforward about the situation, not hiding that he'd been approached, presenting it as information rather than a decision already made. They sat on Caleb's porch in the August evening, the light going long and gold, the cattle visible in the east pasture, and James said, "I'm not selling. I want you to know that, but I thought you should know he's still moving." "He's always moving," Caleb said. "He'll always be moving. That's who he is." "Does it worry you?" Caleb thought about it honestly. "It used to keep me awake," he said. "It's less loud now." James looked at the pasture. "Because of the documentation." "Partly." He considered the rest of it. "And partly because I'm not alone in it the way I was. That changes what it costs." James nodded. He stayed another half hour talking about the summer cattle prices and the road improvement the county was supposedly planning and the question of whether winter would come early this year. All the ordinary things that made up a life lived alongside other lives in a place that required it. When he left, he shook Caleb's hand and said, Tell your wife the cornbread was better than my mother's. Don't tell my mother, Caleb told Evelyn. She looked at him. That's not something I'd repeat. I'm repeating it to you. I won't repeat it further. But the edge of her smile showed, the one that didn't come all the way out, and he'd learned by now not to try to make it come further than it wanted to. Bob. Noah turned 10 in October, and the thing that happened at his birthday was small and not small. Evelyn had made a cake, which required a negotiation with the stove that the stove did not immediately agree to, resulting in a cake that was slightly uneven on one side and had been frosted to compensate, which made the frosting uneven in a different direction. Noah looked at it when it came to the table and said, "It's crooked," and Evelyn said, "Yes," and Noah said, "It's good though," and that was the whole exchange. What happened after the cake was that Noah, sitting at the table with his second piece, said, "I want to learn the cattle work." Caleb looked at him. "The real work," Noah said. "Not the carrying and the holding, the actual work, how you decide things." It was the most purposeful sentence Caleb had heard from him in 2 years. Not just talking, not just answering, stating a want, which was different, which required believing the want was worth stating. "Why now?" Caleb said. Noah thought about it. "Because this is mine too," he said. "Isn't it?" Caleb looked across the table at Evelyn. She was looking at Noah with the expression she had when he didn't know she was watching, the careful private one, but this time she let it stay visible. She didn't look away. "Yes," Caleb said. "It's yours too." They started the following Monday. Noah was up before Caleb, which had never happened before in the 2 years they'd lived together, and was waiting at the barn in his boots with his coat buttoned wrong, which Evelyn had apparently not had time to correct or had decided to leave as his problem. Caleb corrected the buttons without commenting on them and showed him where to start. He was not a natural, which was fine. Naturals were rarer than people said, and usually had other deficits that came with the gift. What Noah was thorough. He wanted to understand why each thing was done before he did it, which slowed the mornings down but produced a boy who, by December, understood the logic of the operation rather than just its procedures. That was harder to teach and more valuable than the procedures. And Caleb hadn't planned to teach it so early, but found that Noah was asking for it, and so he gave it. Evelyn watched the mornings change. She didn't insert herself into the cattle work and didn't offer opinions on it. It was Caleb's domain and Noah's education, and she understood the boundary without it being stated. But Caleb caught her sometimes, standing at the kitchen window with her coffee, watching them in the yard. And the expression on her face in those moments was the same one she'd had watching Noah get his multiplication right. Not pride exactly, something quieter than pride. The feeling of a person watching something work that they helped make possible without being the one who made it. That distinction mattered to her. He'd come to understand that. She was not a person who needed credit. She was a person who needed the thing itself to succeed. The water rights question came up one final time. In the spring of the following year, 18 months after Flegg's survey, when the Territorial Land Office conducted a general review of water access classifications across Glacier County. It was a routine process, not targeted, and Flegg's documentation was reviewed alongside 43 other filings. The Voss classification was confirmed without amendment. Caleb received the confirmation letter on a Tuesday. He put it in the box with the other documents, the deed, the survey, the Millard letters, Aldridge's response filing, the June ruling, all of it organized in the order Evelyn had arranged it 18 months ago on a kitchen table late at night while snow came down outside. And he put the box back in the office where Thomas's papers had been, because that was the right place for it. He stood in the office for a moment. It was a small room, and it still had Thomas's organization to it in the ways that Caleb hadn't changed, the shelves in the particular order his brother had preferred, the window at the angle that caught the afternoon light. He'd been in this room many times in the past 2 years, and it still carried Thomas in it the way rooms carried people who'd spent time in them. Not a haunting, just a presence. The impression of life left in the walls of a place it had occupied. He thought about Thomas keeping records. He thought about the shoebox that had turned out to matter enormously. He thought about how his brother had understood, without anyone telling him, that the things you wrote down were the things that survived you. The things you wrote down were the things that survived you. He thought about Evelyn saying, "Documentation goes to whoever kept better records." He thought about all the things this ranch would have lost if the records hadn't been there. Not just the water rights, not just the land itself, but Noah's mornings in the barn now, and the account book in the kitchen drawer, and the chalk marks on the door frames that were still there because nobody had wiped them away, because they were useful, and because they had become, without anyone deciding they would, part of the texture of the house. He closed the office door and went back to the kitchen. There's a thing that happens to people who survive hard passages that doesn't get talked about much, because it's not dramatic, and it doesn't make a good story in the way that the hard part makes a good story. The hard part has shape. There's a threat and a response and a result, and you can point to the moment it turned. What comes after doesn't have that shape. It's just days, ordinary and accumulating, each one a little better or a little worse than the last, but trending in a direction. And the trending is the whole story, except you can't see the trend while you're inside it. Caleb understood this about his own life only from the outside, looking back. While he was in the bad years after Thomas died, he couldn't see the shape of them. He could only feel the weight. And while he was in the first months with Evelyn, when everything was precarious and Crane was moving and the cattle were short, and Noah was so quiet it was like living beside a wound, he couldn't see that either. He could only work. What he could see now, in the spring of the second year, was the shape of the thing. Not from a great distance, not with the clarity of time and conclusion, but with the particular visibility that came from being far enough in that the beginning was behind you and far enough from the end that you couldn't see it yet. The middle distance, the place where most of life was actually lived. The ranch was not saved in any permanent, final sense. Nothing on the frontier was saved in that sense. It was always being worked, always requiring the next thing, always a winter or a drought, or a bad calf season away from difficulty. But it was held well and getting stronger, the debt to the Billings Bank at less than half its original figure, the herd at 51 head, the most it had been since Thomas was alive, and the house in better repair than it had been in 10 years, which he knew because Evelyn had asked about its history and the previous repairs and had made a timeline in the back of the account book, the way she made timelines of things she was trying to understand. Noah was 11 and knew the difference between a steer with a sound temperament and one that would be trouble, and could tell you why the fence post on the north gate needed to be reset before July, and was reading Treasure Island in the evenings in his room without anyone suggesting he do it. He had also, in the past few months, begun to ask questions about his father, not with grief, or not only with grief, with the curiosity of someone who wanted to know where they came from, who wanted to understand the man whose records had helped save the land he was learning to work. Caleb answered the questions when they came, as honestly as he could, including the parts that were hard to say, that Thomas had made mistakes, that he'd been reckless in some things, that the year before he died, he'd been worried about the ranch in ways he hadn't shared with Caleb, who'd found out only from the papers in the box. He told Noah these things because Noah was asking for truth, not comfort. And you couldn't give a child who was asking for truth the comfortable version without teaching them that the real version wasn't available to them, which was the worst lesson a grown person could pass down. Evelyn listened to these conversations when they happened in the kitchen or on the porch, and she didn't insert herself into them. And afterward, she didn't comment on them, but sometimes she'd find a way to make the evening easier afterward. A better supper than usual, or Robinson Crusoe pulled from the shelf even though Noah had long since graduated to other books, for the comfort of its familiarity. She was not his mother, she didn't try to be. She was something that didn't have a precise name because the situation that produced her didn't have a precise name. She was the woman who had come when the house needed someone and had become, through daily presence and accumulated care, the person the house was organized around. Not because she demanded it, because she showed up every day and did the next thing, and the next thing, and the one after that, until the shape of her was part of the shape of the place. In June, Caleb rode out to the east pasture in the early morning to check the fence line after a wind that had come through the night before, and he found the post that had been leaning since before Evelyn arrived, the second post from the gate, the one she'd noticed on her first day, the one Noah had drawn in charcoal on his first piece of paper for her. It had finally gone down. He stood looking at it in the morning light, the post at an angle, the wire sagging but not broken, the fence compromised but fixable. He thought about Evelyn's voice that first day, talking to Noah, who wasn't answering. You can usually tell the ones that are going to go. They have a kind of lean to them that looks like they're tired, like they've been holding against the pressure so long they've just run out of reasons to keep doing it. He pulled the post, dug the hole deeper, reset the post in fresh soil, tamped it down properly, restrung the wire. It took an hour. He did it carefully, the way he'd learned to do things carefully. Not because he'd been careless before, but because he understood now what careful meant and what it protected. When he came back to the house, Evelyn was in the garden she'd started along the south side, the one that had been bare dirt when she arrived and was now growing things in the organized, purposeful way she grew most things. She was on her knees pulling something that didn't belong there, not looking up when he came through the gate. The east post finally went, he said. I know. I heard it in the wind last night. She sat back on her heels. Did you reset it? Deep this time. Good. She looked up at him, shading her eyes. There was dirt on her forearms and a smear of it along her jaw where she'd pushed her hair back. She looked, he thought, like someone who lived here. Not like someone passing through or maintaining or surviving. Like someone who had arrived and stayed and become part of the ground. He'd thought, on the train platform in September, that she had eyes like Winter Creek water. He'd noticed that in the first moment, before he'd had time to notice anything else. What he knew now, after 18 months, was that Winter Creek water looked flat and cold from the outside and ran deep and constant underneath. And the depth was the part that mattered, the part that didn't freeze, the part that kept moving when everything else stopped. What? She said. Nothing. You're doing the thing where you're thinking something and deciding not to say it. I say things. You say things when you've decided to say them. That's different. She turned back to the garden. You don't have to say it. I was thinking about the first day, he said, when you noticed that post. She was quiet, pulling something from the soil. You noticed everything, he said. You came in with one bag and a cut on your lip and you started noticing everything immediately. It's useful to notice things. It is. He leaned on the garden gate. I didn't notice enough before you came. I was looking at the problems without seeing the shape of them. She sat back again and looked at him. You were managing, she said. When you're managing, you don't have room to see the shape. You're too busy holding the thing up. Is that what I was doing? That's what you were doing. She looked at her hands, the dirt in the creases. I'd been managing for so long before I came here that I'd gotten thin. The kind of thin that isn't the body, just the part of you that has reasons. She said it in the way she said the things she rarely said, carefully, with the precision of someone who'd thought about the language before using it. I got here and there was so much to do, and the doing of it, she paused, the doing of it filled something back in. He understood that. He understood it because the same thing had happened to him, in parallel, in a different key. The shape of his own life filling back in as the days accumulated, and the work produced results, and the house became a home again, and Noah began to be a boy who asked for things instead of a boy who was just enduring. They had filled each other back in. That was the plain truth of it. Not dramatically, not in a moment, not with a clear before and after. Daily. The way water filled a container, steadily, at the level it had reached, then a little more. Evelyn, he said. She looked up. I'm glad the agency sent you. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, I'm glad you wrote. She went back to the garden. He stood at the gate in the June morning and watched her work and thought about the man who had stood on a train platform a year and a half ago with his hat in his hands, expecting nothing in particular, and the woman who had stepped off the train in broken boots and looked at the camera of the world with the expression of someone who intended to be honest about what they found. Two people who had lost things they couldn't recover. Two people who had, without planning it, built something that couldn't be taken back. There is a version of this story that ends with Crane defeated and the land secured and the family complete and everything tidy. That version is shorter and more satisfying in the immediate sense. The way a knot pulled tight is more satisfying than a knot worked slowly loose from the inside. But the real shape of it, the true shape of any life that has come through difficulty without being destroyed by it, is not a knot pulled tight. It's the fence post reset properly in deep soil, standing not because nothing will ever push against it again, but because it was set to hold. Crane was still in the county. He would always be in the county, or someone like him would be. The water rights question might come up again in 5 years, in 10, in whatever form the law allowed. The frontier didn't offer permanent resolution. It offered the next season, and the one after that, and the slow accumulation of what you'd built against the slow accumulation of what could take it. What Caleb Voss had learned in the year and 8 months since a woman climbed off a train in broken boots and refused help standing up was that the thing that survived difficulty was not strength in the way he'd always understood strength, not the capacity to hold alone, not the endurance of isolation, not the performance of being someone who didn't need. The thing that survived was what you built with someone else. The records kept together, and the fence posts reset together, and the lamp filled, and the supper made, and the child read to, and the document filed in 2 offices instead of 1. Evelyn understood this. She'd understood it before she arrived, in the way that people who have survived alone for long enough understand what aloneness costs. Not as a weakness, but as a measurement. She knew what she'd spent and what it had taken and what was left. And she'd arrived at a broken ranch in September with what was left, and she'd worked with it. And what was left had been enough. That was the thing that deserved saying, the thing that sat at the center of all of it. Not that she had been extraordinary, though she had been. Not that what they'd built was perfect, because it wasn't and it never would be, but that what was left, in her, in him, in an 8-year-old boy who hadn't spoken to strangers in months, had been enough to begin with. People arrived at hard things spent and diminished, and believing the diminished version was the final version. They looked at what remained after loss and decided it was the verdict. It was not the verdict. It was the material. What you built from what remained, that was the verdict. In the east pasture, the fence line held. In the kitchen, the account book showed a number that was smaller than last year's and would be smaller still by December. In the barn, a boy who had once been silent beyond managing was learning which animals to trust and why. In the garden along the south wall, a woman who had arrived with 1 bag and a broken clasp was growing things in the purposeful, organized way she grew most things. In soil she had worked herself, in a place she had chosen and kept choosing. The ranch that had been going under was not going under anymore. The family that had been losing itself was not lost. The woman who had arrived with nothing had not arrived with nothing at all. She had arrived with everything that mattered. The kind that couldn't be put in a bag, couldn't be assessed by a land office, couldn't be taken by a man in a good coat who stepped over you and didn't look back. The kind that showed up every morning and did the next thing. The kind that noticed fence posts before they fell and kept records that held in 2 offices and fired a shot 3 feet in front of a man's boots in the dark and called it accurately, without bravado, from the second rafter of a barn. The kind that read to a grieving boy until he had opinions about Crusoe's decisions. The kind that, when someone finally said, "I want you here, not because we need help, but because it's you," said back, "I'd like to stay. Not because I need to, because this is where I want to be." That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. And the proof of it was in the account book, and the survey on file and the chalk marks still on the door frames, and the boy doing multiplication at the kitchen table, and the lamp that was always full now, always full, because someone had made a habit of filling it. The small things, the daily things, the things that looked like ordinary life and were, in fact, the whole of it.